Hey there, story lovers. This is Gringotts Hub, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. What if Gringotts discovered Dumbledore had stolen Harry's Potter-Black-Peverell-Slytherin Lordship since birth? Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1, The Audit. The Owl Never Came. That was the first wrong thing about Harry Potter's 11th birthday. The thing that should have happened, didn't. He'd spent the morning the way he spent most mornings at number 4, Privet Drive, which meant being ignored by his aunt, avoided by his cousin, and occasionally glared at by his uncle over the rim of a newspaper whenever Harry had the audacity to exist too loudly in the kitchen. Dudley had gotten 37 birthday presents in June and sulked about it for a week. Harry had gotten a pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks and a card from Aunt Petunia that said many happy returns in her small, tight handwriting, which he suspected she'd bought in a multipack somewhere because it was the same card she'd given Mrs. Figg next door. He didn't mind the socks. They were thick ones, at least. What he did mind, on this particular Tuesday morning in July, was the quiet. He'd heard things, overheard things, really, the way you learned to overhear everything when you lived in a house where information was kept from you like food during a diet. He knew about Hogwarts. He knew about the letters. He'd seen the name Dumbledore written on the back of an envelope his aunt had burned so quickly it had still been smoking when she dropped it in the bin, and he'd caught enough fragments over the years, freak school, just like his parents, unnatural, to have constructed a fairly detailed picture of what was supposed to happen. He was supposed to get a letter. He sat on the front step with a bowl of cereal that had gone slightly soft and watched the empty sky. Nothing. An hour passed. He went back inside. Dudley was watching something loud on television and Vernon was somewhere making phone calls for work, and Harry drifted upstairs to his cupboard under the stairs and sat on his thin mattress in the dark and thought, with the particular flatness of a child who has learned not to hope for things, that maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe there was no letter. Maybe the fragments he'd collected and built into something weren't a picture at all, just pieces of different puzzles that didn't fit together. He'd just about talked himself into believing it when someone knocked on the front door. Not the owl flap. The actual door, with actual knuckles, in a sharp, precise rhythm that somehow managed to sound impatient even through solid wood and a hallway's worth of distance. Harry heard Vernon answer it. He heard Vernon say, in his dealing with the neighbor's voice, "Yes. Can I help you?" and then go completely silent in a way that was different from his usual silences. Vernon's usual silences were heavy and deliberate, used as weapons. This one sounded like surprise hitting something hard. "I require the boy," said a voice Harry didn't recognize, clipped, dry, and carrying the particular quality of someone who had never once in their life worried about whether they would be listened to. "Harry Potter. You will fetch him, Mr. Dursley, and you will do it promptly." "Now see here, you will do it promptly," the voice repeated, in exactly the same tone, which somehow made it worse. Harry was already out of the cupboard. He came around the corner of the hallway and stopped. Standing in the doorway, his uncle filling the frame in the way large, defensive men fill door frames, shoulders squared, chin out, was a goblin. Harry had never seen a goblin. He'd read the word, assembled the description from overheard fragments and the one library book about folklore he'd managed to get from the school library before Marcus Polly tore 3 pages out of it to be funny. But reading a description and seeing the thing described were different enterprises entirely. The goblin was shorter than Harry, which wasn't saying much at 11, but it carried itself with the absolute certainty of something that could and would bite you. It wore a suit that would have looked ordinary on a banker except for the silver threading that caught the light in ways that seemed slightly wrong for ordinary thread to do. Its face was long and sharp-featured and old in the way that mountains are old, not decayed, just enduring. Its eyes were dark amber, and they were looking directly at Harry with the kind of focused attention that made you feel simultaneously assessed and, somehow, already found acceptable. "Harry Potter," it said. Not a question. "Yes," Harry said. His uncle made a noise between them. "Now just a bloody minute, this is my house and I'll not have," the the goblin turned those amber eyes on Vernon Dursley with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who has 10,000 years of institutional authority behind them and genuinely cannot conceive of the concept of being impressed by a man in a polo shirt. Vernon stopped talking. His mouth remained open for a moment, working silently, then closed. "My name," the goblin said, returning its attention to Harry, "is Ragnarok. I am the Director of Gringotts Bank, London branch. I have come personally because what I have to discuss with you is a matter of institutional significance and personal urgency." A brief pause. "You are the last descendant of 4 of the oldest magical houses in Britain. You have been robbed since you were 15 months old. And today, on your 11th birthday, we are going to begin fixing that." Another pause, shorter. "May I come in?" Harry looked at his uncle, who was now the color of old plaster, then back at the goblin. "It's not really my house," Harry said honestly. "No," Ragnarok agreed. "It is not. But you are the one I asked." Harry stepped back from the doorway. "Come in." Vernon made a sound that might have been a word. "Mr. Dursley," Ragnarok said pleasantly as he crossed the threshold, "I would recommend sitting down. This conversation does not concern you, but its consequences will affect your living arrangements, and you may find that easier to absorb from a seated position." They ended up in the kitchen, which was the only room with enough chairs. Dudley appeared in the doorway, took one look at Ragnarok, and retreated. Petunia stood at the counter with her arms crossed very tightly and her face doing something complicated that Harry couldn't quite read. It wasn't just fear, it was something older than fear, something that had been living in her face for years and now had a reason to come out. Ragnarok set a leather case on the kitchen table. It was the kind of case that looked ordinary but clearly wasn't. It sat on the table with more presence than its size warranted, and when Ragnarok's fingers touched the clasps they made a sound like something very old being unlocked rather than just opened. "Before I explain the substance of what I've found," Ragnarok said, settling into a chair with the ease of someone who sat at the head of tables for a living, "I need to establish something clearly. Do you know who you are, Mr. Potter?" "Not the name. The lineage." Harry sat down across from him. His cereal was still on the counter, forgotten. "I know my parents were called James and Lily Potter. I know they died when I was 1. I know they were wizards." He said the last word carefully, watching his aunt's face as he did. Petunia's jaw tightened. "I've worked out there's a school. Hogwarts. That is approximately 1% of what you should know," Ragnarok said, without judgment. He opened the case and removed a sheaf of documents, real parchment, not paper, the kind with weight and texture, and spread them on the table with methodical precision. "Let me give you the rest of it." What followed was, Harry would think later, the most efficient demolition of everything he thought he understood about his own life that could possibly have been accomplished over a kitchen table before lunch. The Potter family, Ragnarok explained, were one of the oldest pure-blood wizarding dynasties in Britain, though blood purity, he added with a flatness that suggested personal contempt for the concept, was neither here nor there. What mattered was the age of the family magic, the weight of the accumulated lordship, and the trust vaults that had been established over centuries. James Potter had been Lord Potter, holder of a seat on the Wisengamot, the magical parliament of Britain, and heir to a personal fortune that made the word comfortable sound faintly insulting. That was just the start. Through his grandmother, Doria Blackney Potter, Harry watched the name go in and settle somewhere behind his eyes. James had carried a secondary claim to the Black family line, one that had remained dormant but legally intact. The Black family were the oldest of the Sacred 28, the pure-blood families who had charted their lineages back to the early Middle Ages with the obsessive precision of people who had nothing better to do with their time. Their vaults were older than the Potters. Their seat on the Wisengamot was older. Their ancestral magic was different in character, darker, more formal, built on contract and consequence rather than the warmer, more instinctive magic of the Potter line. "There is more," Ragnarok said. Harry had the feeling there was considerably more. Through Lily Evans Potter, and here Ragnarok paused in a way that suggested what was coming was the part he'd been building toward, Harry carried 2 further inheritances that had been, until this morning, entirely hidden from him. Lily Potter, née Evans, had been a Muggle-born witch of extraordinary power. But Muggle-born was a phrase that required examination. What it actually meant, in Lily's case, was that her magical heritage had been dormant for several generations, not absent. The Evans line traced, through a branch that had been carefully severed from wizarding society in the 1700s, to one of the most significant wizarding families in British history. The Peverells. Harry stared at the parchment Ragnarok slid toward him. The Peverell family tree was old enough that the earliest names were written in a script he didn't recognize. 3 brothers at the root of it, their names connected by lines that branched and spread and occasionally ended in the small, sharp symbols that denoted early death. The Deathly Hallows story, Harry said slowly. He didn't know why he knew it, fragments again, pieces of things, a children's book he'd found once in a box of his parents' things his aunt had inexplicably kept. The Tales of Beetle the Bard. He'd read it in one sitting in his cupboard with a torch, and the last story had sat in him for years. Ragnarok looked at him steadily. You are aware of it. 3 brothers. 3 gifts. 1 from death. Harry's voice was careful. It's a fairy story. Most things that matter, Ragnarok said, began as fairy stories. He tapped the parchment. The Peverell Lordship is real. The estate attached to it is real. And the Hallows themselves, whatever their true nature, are considered hereditary property of the Peverell line. Which means they are yours. The kitchen was very quiet. Vernon had, at some point, sat down heavily in the chair by the window. Petunia hadn't moved from the counter. You said 4 houses, Harry said. His voice was steady. He noticed that distantly, the steadiness of it. Ragnarok's expression did something subtle. Not quite respect, something more measured than that, more considered. He reached back into the case and produced a single sheet of parchment that was different from the others, older, darker, written in ink that seemed to have dried in a different century. The Slytherin line, he said, ended in the male descent with Voldemort. The name landed in the kitchen like a dropped glass. Petunia made a small, involuntary sound. Vernon's chair creaked. He was born Tom Marvolo Riddle, Ragnarok continued, with the detachment of someone reciting historical fact, to Merrippy Gaunt, last of the female Gaunt line, which was itself the last traceable branch of Salazar Slytherin's descendants. When Riddle died, or appeared to die, on the night of October 31, 1981, magical law regarding extinct noble houses came into effect. An extinct house's lordship reverts to the nearest magical claimant through conquest or blood connection. Which is me, Harry said. You defeated him as an infant, Ragnarok said. Wizarding law is unambiguous on this point. Conquest claim is one of the oldest forms of inheritance. Additionally, he tapped the darker parchment, there is a blood connection. Distant, indirect, and deeply uncomfortable for anyone who would prefer not to think about it, but legally ironclad. The Slytherin, Gaunt, and Peverell lines all trace to the same founding families. You are the convergence point. Harry sat back in his chair. 4 lordships. 4 Wisingamot seats. Vaults he'd never known about. A family tree that looked less like a tree and more like the load-bearing wall of the entire wizarding world. You said I've been robbed, Harry said. Yes. Since I was 15 months old. Since the night your parents died and Albus Dumbledore placed himself as your magical guardian without petition, without court approval, and without your parents' authorization. Ragnarok's voice hadn't changed in temperature at all. He could have been reading a grocery list. Your parents had a will, Mr. Potter. It was sealed and ignored. Your godfather, Sirius Black, was your designated guardian. He was imprisoned without trial. Your family's accounts have been accessed repeatedly under Dumbledore's guardian authority, not emptied, because that would have been too obvious, but drawn from consistently. Stipends paid to this household, a gesture around the kitchen that somehow managed to convey precisely what he thought of it, have been siphoned at a ratio of roughly 6 to 1. For every galleon that arrived here, 6 were redirected. Redirected where? Various places. Several Order of the Phoenix operational accounts. A fund called the Hogwarts Discretionary Scholarship Trust that has disbursed money to students Dumbledore wished to recruit. A private account held under the name of a shell identity that our cursebreakers dismantled this morning. Ragnarok paused. Several purchases that we can only describe as curious, including what appears to be a significant private collection of artifacts related to the Deathly Hallows. The room was silent again. Harry thought about his cupboard. The thin mattress. The socks from his aunt. The 37 birthday presents Dudley had gotten while Harry had watched and learned not to want things. He thought about that very carefully, and very quietly, and then he put it away because it wasn't useful right now. How much? He asked. Ragnarok told him. The number had enough digits that Harry had to count them twice. That, Ragnarok said, watching him count, is the discrepancy between what your accounts should hold and what they currently hold. That is what has been taken. It does not account for the value of political decisions made in your name without your knowledge, the lordship votes cast in your name without your authorization, or the psychological and developmental damage of being raised in deliberate ignorance of your own identity, though we at Gringotts believe those categories to have value too, even if the Wisengamot has not yet developed an adequate framework for assessing them. But you're working on it, Harry said. Something moved in Ragnarok's face. Not a smile. Goblins, Harry would learn, had a different relationship with smiling than humans did. But something adjacent. We are working on it. Harry looked down at the parchment spread across the kitchen table. His life, laid out in ink. A fortune. 4 names. A family tree with too many dead ends and 1 living point. What do I need to sign? He said. His aunt made a sharp noise behind him. Harry, he turned and looked at her. Not with anger, he didn't feel angry, not yet. The anger was there but it was sitting underneath something cooler and more useful. He just looked at her with 11 years of knowing her face and said, "You knew." It wasn't a question. Petunia's mouth went tight. Her arms tightened across her chest. For a moment she looked like she was going to deny it, and then something in his steady gaze, something that perhaps his mother had had, because it certainly hadn't come from anyone in this house, made the denial die before she spoke it. I knew, she said quietly, that Dumbledore sent us money. I knew what he said it was for. She paused. I didn't know it was yours. I thought it was, charity. I thought he was, you thought it was easier, Harry said, still in that same quiet voice, not to ask questions. Her chin came up, which was answer enough. Harry turned back to the table. What do I need to sign? He said again, to Ragnarok. Ragnarok produced a quill that was clearly not an ordinary quill, its shaft had a faint luminescence, like something held too close to a candle from the inside. Lordship claiming documents for House Potter and House Black will be sufficient for today. The Peverell and Slytherin claims are more complex and will require formal hearings. However, signing these 2 will give you full legal standing as a minor lord, revoke Dumbledore's guardian authority, and trigger an automatic audit disclosure to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Meaning Dumbledore will know, Harry said. Not immediately. The disclosure goes to Madame Bones at the DMLE. She is, Ragnarok said, with a faint and apparently involuntary note of approval, not Dumbledore's creature. Harry picked up the quill. It was warm in his hand, not uncomfortably so, but noticeably, like a handshake with something that had been waiting a long time for this. The first document was dense with text in that same heavy parchment and old ink style, but certain phrases caught his eye as he scanned it. Sole surviving heir. Full magical inheritance. All rights, titles, properties, and responsibilities thereto. He read the whole thing. Ragnarok waited with the patience of someone who approved of reading. Harry signed. The parchment glowed, briefly in gold, in a way that was nothing like candlelight and everything like something being made official at a level deeper than paper. The second document was for House Black and slightly longer. Harry read it too. One line near the bottom made him pause: revocation of all proxy voting rights held by unauthorized guardians, effective immediately and retroactively recorded. Retroactively, he said. It means every vote Dumbledore cast in your name on the Wizengamot over the past decade, Ragnarok said, is now legally questionable. Harry thought about what that meant. Thought about laws that had passed and motions that had carried by narrow margins. Thought about a decade of a very clever man steering the wizarding world with 4 extra votes in his pocket. He signed the second document. The glow was brighter this time. Gold and something darker woven through it. The Black family magic had a different character, just as Ragnarok had said. More formal. The color of old contracts and kept promises. When the light faded, Harry felt different. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden surge of power or a rush of knowledge or anything that would have looked impressive from the outside. It was more like the feeling when your ears finally pop after a long car journey, a subtle, disorienting sense that something that had been slightly wrong for a very long time had just corrected itself. Like the world had been slightly out of focus for his whole life, and now it wasn't. He put the quill down. There is one more thing, Ragnarok said. He reached into the case one final time and produced a small envelope. Plain, cream-colored. Harry's name on the front in 2 different handwriting styles, one bold and untidy, one neat and precise. This was held in your primary vault. Your parents left it there the week before they died, under a time-locked seal that would only open upon the triggering of a lordship claim. He held it out. It is not bank property. It is yours. Harry took it. He didn't open it. Not here, with his uncle's wheezing breath filling the kitchen and his aunt's tight face watching him and the whole strange, enormous morning pressing down on everything. He tucked it into the pocket of his oversized jeans and felt the weight of it settle against his hip. What happens now? He asked. Now, Ragnarok said, closing his case with a series of precise clicks, you come to Gringotts. Today, if you are willing. You should see your vaults. You should meet the curse breakers who have been working on your accounts. And you should begin to understand the full scope of what you have inherited before Dumbledore is aware that you know any of this. He stood. It is always better to understand the board before your opponent realizes the game has changed. Is it a game? Harry asked. To him, Ragnarok said evenly, everything is a game. The difference is that until now, he was the only one who knew the rules. Harry looked around the kitchen, the low ceiling, the 2 clean countertops, the familiar cramped smell of a house he'd never been allowed to think of as his. His uncle was staring at the middle distance with the expression of a man whose entire conception of the world was quietly being renegotiated. His aunt was looking at Harry with something in her face he'd never seen there before. It took him a moment to identify it. It was something like "I'm sorry." Buried under 15 years of choices she'd made in the other direction, but there. He didn't say anything to it. He wasn't ready for that yet. He turned back to Ragnarok. Let me get my things, he said. Getting his things took approximately 4 minutes because he didn't have many of them. A change of clothes. The Beetle the Bard book. A photograph of a man and woman that he'd kept hidden under the mattress in the cupboard for so long that the corners were soft. He held the photograph for a moment, his father's arm around his mother's shoulders, both of them young and laughing at something off camera, his father's hair exactly as terrible as Harry's in a way that felt like a message, and then packed it carefully between the clothes. He came back downstairs with a rucksack. Ragnarok was in the hallway, standing with his case, exactly where he'd been going. Vernon was still at the kitchen table. Petunia was in the hallway, and when Harry came down the stairs she stepped forward with a movement that wasn't quite reaching out and wasn't quite stopping him, hovering in between. Harry, she said. He looked at her. Your mother, she said, and then stopped, and the sentence went somewhere internal that he couldn't follow. Her jaw worked. She would have been proud of you. She was better at this than me. It came out stiffly, like something she'd kept in storage for too long. All of it. She was better. It was the most honest thing his aunt had said to him in 11 years. I know, Harry said, and he meant it without bitterness, which surprised him a little. He meant it like a fact, which was its own kind of sadness but cleaner than the alternative. I'll send word. When I know more. He walked out the front door. The street was quiet in the late morning way of suburban streets in summer, a few birds moving in the trees, a lawn mower running somewhere 2 streets over. The ordinary world, absolutely indifferent to the fact that it had just been fundamentally reorganized. Ragnarok produced a small disc from his jacket pocket, silver, etched with symbols Harry couldn't yet read, and held it out. Port key. It will take us directly to the director's entrance. You have been added to the wards. Harry took it. You were that sure I'd come? I was that sure, Ragnarok said, that you were your mother's child. She had your same quality of taking information seriously. He turned the disc once in his fingers. She also had your quality of asking questions that cut to the center of things rather than the comfortable edges. You knew her. She came to us when she was 17 to establish a personal vault separate from the family accounts. Your father came with her. The amber eyes held something that wasn't quite nostalgia but lived in the neighborhood. She tipped my assistant over a paperwork discrepancy she spotted in under 5 minutes. He had made the error on purpose, as we sometimes do, to assess new clients. She spotted it and said so without apology. We gave her the account immediately. Harry smiled, for the first time all morning. Ready? Ragnarok asked. Yes, Harry said, and meant it in a way that was bigger than the word. Ragnarok touched the disc. The street dissolved. Gringotts hit Harry's senses all at once, cool marble air and torchlight and the low, industrial hum of something very large and very old doing very serious work below them. They were in a corridor that wasn't the main hall, narrower and better lit, lined with portraits of goblins who all turned to look at Harry with expressions ranging from curious to assessing to something that might have been cautious respect. The floor was smooth stone and Harry's trainers made no sound on it. This way, Ragnarok said. The director's offices were not what Harry expected. He'd half imagined something ostentatious, gold everywhere, the kind of display wealthy people made to remind you of your relative unwealthiness. Instead it was functional and exact, a large desk with several things on it that appeared to be in active use, shelving that held ledgers in the way a working library held books rather than in the way a rich person held books to impress guests, and a long table against one wall covered in documents that Harry recognized as copies of what Ragnarok had shown him in the kitchen, plus considerably more. 4 other goblins were in the room. They looked up when Harry entered. These, Ragnarok said, are the cursebreakers and account analysts who have been working your case for the past 3 months, since the automatic audit trigger activated. He named them in rapid succession: Griphook, who was younger than the others and looked at Harry with naked curiosity; Goldtooth, who managed accounts and had the expression of someone who had seen every variety of financial misconduct and was still offended by this one; Sharp Edge, the senior cursebreaker, a female goblin with a scar running from her left ear to her jaw and an air of someone who had broken through things considerably more dangerous than Dumbledore's wards, and finally an older goblin called Bonewright, who handled matters touching wizarding law and treaty and who, Harry would eventually understand, was one of the most dangerous goblins in Britain in a sitting-down-with-documents kind of way. Mr. Potter, said Goldtooth, I have spent 3 months wanting to call this account a clerical error because the alternative was too professionally insulting to contemplate. I want you to know that the money I am about to show you is real. Good morning, Harry said. Goldtooth looked at him for a moment. Good morning, he said, apparently satisfied. Griphook spread a large chart on the table, a visual map of Harry's accounts, color-coded in a way that made the shape of the theft immediately visible even before you read the numbers. The Potter Trust was the largest, at the center. Branching from it were the Black Estate accounts, the Peverell holding accounts, and the pending Slytherin estate claims. Running between all of them, like a channel that had been dug in secret, were the outflow lines, money and property and voting rights moving quietly, steadily, for a decade, toward 3 main destinations. The first destination, Bonewright said, is legitimate by appearance, the stipend to the Dursley household. We calculate the actual amount disbursed there against what was drawn from your accounts, and the ratio is approximately 1 in 7. Not 1 in 6, as I told you earlier, we refined the calculation this morning. 1 in 7, Harry said. For every 7 galleons drawn from your account in the name of your welfare, Bonewright said, with the precision of someone who was choosing each word carefully because they mattered, you received the equivalent of 1. Harry was quiet for a moment. And the other 6? The second destination is a set of operational accounts for an organization called the Order of the Phoenix, which Dumbledore leads. The transfers are categorized in the ledgers as Magical Guardian Discretionary Expenditure, which is a legitimate category, but only for amounts related to the ward's education, health, or direct welfare. The amounts transferred exceed any reasonable interpretation of those categories by a factor of roughly 40. And the third? Sharp Edge, the Cursebreaker, spoke for the first time. Her voice was low and had the texture of things that had been filed to points. The third destination is the one that took us longest to trace. It is a private collection account held under an identity that we now believe to be Dumbledore's himself, though the legal name is an anagram. She paused. He has been acquiring objects related to the Peverell inheritance. Specifically, objects believed to have connections to the Deathly Hallows. The room was quiet except for the hum of the building beneath them. He's been using my money, Harry said slowly, to buy things that are supposed to be mine. More than that, Ragnarok said. He has been using your political standing, your 4 Wizengamot seats, to advocate for legislation that limits the rights of minor lords to claim inheritance without adult wizarding sponsorship. Had that legislation passed 3 years ago when he first proposed it, this audit would have been legally obstructed. He let that sit for a moment. It did not pass. It failed by 2 votes. Harry looked at the account map. At all those outflow lines, steady and quiet and running for 10 years in the wrong direction. What are the pending Peverell and Slytherin claims waiting for? He asked. The Peverell claim requires a formal hearing before a Wizengamot panel, Bonewright said. It is an unusual inheritance, the dormancy period exceeds the standard threshold, and there are several competing minor claims from distant branches that will need to be formally dismissed. We expect it to be uncomplicated, given the strength of your documentation, but it requires the hearing. He paused. The Slytherin claim is more politically sensitive. There are individuals who will contest it. Not because they have a stronger claim, but because they will not want to accept that you hold it. Malfoy, Harry said. Goldtooth made a sound that was the goblin equivalent of a rueful laugh. Among others. Set up the hearings, Harry said. Whatever timeline is appropriate. Ragnarok nodded once. There is also the matter of your Hogwarts letter, which was held at this office rather than allowing it to be delivered through standard owl post. We felt it more appropriate that you receive it here, with context. He produced it, cream envelope, green ink, the Hogwarts seal in red wax, and placed it on the table in front of Harry. Harry picked it up and turned it over. Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He stared at the address for a long moment. The cupboard under the stairs. He set the letter down, not because he was ignoring it but because he needed a second, and the goblins, sharp and perceptive as they were, gave him one without comment. He breathed in the cool marble air of Gringotts and thought about a cupboard and a thin mattress and 11 years of being the wrong shape for every space he'd been put in. Then he picked up the letter and opened it. The Hogwarts letter was exactly what it was. An invitation. A list of books and equipment. A reminder that the Hogwarts Express departed September 1st from platform 9 3/4. Ordinary, in the way that doorways are ordinary, not remarkable in themselves but definitive about what was on the other side. I'll need to buy my school supplies, Harry said. Your vault is accessible immediately, Goldtooth said. Griphook will take you. Harry folded the letter and put it in his pocket beside his parents' envelope. He hadn't opened that one yet. He would, But not here, not in front of an audience. It was the kind of thing that deserved privacy, he thought, if anything did. "One more thing," Harry said, before they moved toward the vaults. He looked at Ragnarok directly, the way you could only look at someone who had already seen the worst of your situation and hadn't flinched from it. Sirius Black. Ragnarok met his gaze. "The legal situation is complex." "He didn't get a trial," Harry said. "I read the Black family documents. He's my godfather. He was my parents' designated guardian for me. He's in Azkaban without a trial." He paused. "Can Gringotts do anything about that?" "Gringotts," Ragnarok said carefully, "is a financial institution. What Gringotts can do is provide documentation that constitutes grounds for a motion before the Wisengamot. What Gringotts can do is provide Madame Bones at the DMLE with the audit disclosure that already names Dumbledore's illegal guardian claim, which creates a natural investigative thread that leads directly to the question of why the named legal guardian was imprisoned without process." He paused. "What Gringotts can do is ensure that the right people have the right information." "Then do that," Harry said. "It was already in progress," Ragnarok said. "But it is satisfying to confirm that you want it." Harry nodded. Griphook led him out of the director's office and through a door that required 2 keys and a touch of what Griphook confirmed, with some evident professional interest, was Harry's own magical signature, which, he noted, was considerably more complex than the standard lordship signatures he usually processed, layered in a way that suggested the 4 house magics were already beginning to integrate. The cart ride down to the vaults was fast and cold and went much deeper than Harry expected. Levels he couldn't count, the torches blurring past, the stone walls streaming with underground water. He held the edge of the cart and let himself feel the speed of it, the deep stone smell of it, the sense of going somewhere that had been waiting for him specifically. Vault 687 was the Potter Trust vault. When the door opened, Harry stood very still for a moment. He'd expected gold. There was gold, a great deal of it, heaped in a way that ceased to be a financial quantity and started to be a geological feature. But what he hadn't expected was the rest of it. The documents, neatly shelved. The family artifacts, carefully arranged. The portraits, small, canvas miniatures, several dozen of them, of people he didn't know yet but who, based on the shape of noses and the angle of chins and the color of eyes that matched his own, he was related to. One of the miniatures in the nearest row showed a young man with wild black hair and an expression of permanent mischief who was currently staring at Harry with an expression of total arrested shock. The miniature slowly raised a hand to its face and covered its mouth. Then it turned to the portrait beside it, a woman with dark red hair and green eyes exactly like Harry's, who was also staring, and made a sound that, even in miniature form, was clearly a very emotional laugh. Harry took 2 steps toward them and stopped, because his throat was doing something inconvenient. "Hi," he said, to the 2 tiny portraits. His mother covered her eyes with both hands. His father put his arm around her. "Hi, kid," the James portrait said, and his voice was small but it was real, it was his, and Harry stood in his vault for the first time and thought, "I'm going to fix all of this." Not a question. Not a hope. A decision. Chapter 2, The Weight of Names. The letter from his parents burned a hole in his pocket for 3 hours before Harry let himself read it. He spent those 3 hours learning Gringotts from the inside, which was not a small education. Griphook took him through the secondary vaults, not the main Potter Trust vault, but the satellite accounts, the ones that held specific categories of inheritance. There was a weapons vault that Harry wasn't allowed to open yet because the wards on it required him to reach his majority or demonstrate specific magical competency, which Griphook explained with the air of someone trying very hard not to sound impressed by what was in there. There was a library vault, an actual underground room lined floor to ceiling with books, scrolls, and manuscripts in languages Harry didn't recognize, which made him think immediately and with some urgency of a particular Muggle-born girl he hadn't met yet but who he suspected would cry actual tears at the sight of this room. There was a vault that held nothing but portraits, dozens of them stacked carefully, and Griphook explained that these were the official family portrait collection, the large-scale ones, the ones that belonged on walls, which had been removed from Potter and Black ancestral properties after the properties were quietly sealed following the deaths of Harry's parents. Sealed by whom? Harry asked. By authority of the magical guardian, Griphook said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had an opinion but was saving it. Of course, Harry said. The Black family vault was on a different level entirely, and the cart ride to it went past several vaults that seemed to make the air around them feel distinctly unhappy. Harry mentioned this. Griphook said that the Black family had historically kept some items that were, and he used this word with full professional weight, motivated. The Black Vault itself was enormous, larger than the Potter Trust Vault, and organized with a precision that suggested either a very structured family or a very organized cursebreaker who'd spent time in here, and Griphook confirmed it was the latter. Sharp Edge had spent 3 weeks in this vault documenting its contents, and she had found 7 items that Dumbledore had apparently attempted to move under guardian authority that the vault wards had rejected because the Black family magic was considerably more particular about who touched what than the Potters had been. It rejected him, Harry said. 6 times, Griphook confirmed. The 7th attempt triggered an alarm that is part of why the audit began when it did, 3 months earlier than the automatic Hogwarts trigger would have initiated it. Harry stood in the middle of the Black Vault and looked at the shelves and thought about Sirius, sitting in Azkaban, not knowing any of this. Not knowing his vault had defended itself. Not knowing his godson was standing here right now. He made a mental note to move faster on the legal proceedings. It was after midday when Griphook brought him back up to the ground level, and a different goblin, quieter, more administrative in character, led him to a private room off the main corridor and said that Director Ragnarok had arranged lunch and that the room was warded for privacy and that he was to take as long as he needed. The room had a small table, 2 chairs, a spread of food that leaned toward the functional end of the catering spectrum, and no windows. Harry sat down, ate half a sandwich without tasting it, and then took the letter out of his pocket. It was heavier than it should have been, for a single envelope. His name on the front. Both their handwriting, mixed together like they'd passed it back and forth in each written parts. He broke the seal carefully, because it seemed important to do it carefully, like it was a thing worth treating with respect. There were 3 sheets of parchment inside, and a small, flat disc, bronze, unremarkable looking, that he set aside for the moment. Harry, the first page began, in his father's handwriting, bold and slightly impatient even in letter form. If you're reading this, you're at least 11 and you've claimed the lordship, which means you're smarter and better organized than I was at 11, so well done there. There are things you need to know and we're going to tell you all of them, but first, your mother wants to go first, because she says I'll bury the important parts under jokes, which is fair. Harry turned the page. His mother's handwriting was smaller and more precise. My darling boy. I've spent 3 days trying to write this letter and I keep starting over because I can't make it good enough, and your father finally told me that you don't need it to be good enough, you just need it to be true. So here is the truth. You were the most wanted child in the history of people wanting children. I know that sounds like something every parent says, but I'm telling you specifically because you may have grown up without being made to feel it, and I need you to know that every choice we made, every protective measure we took, every plan we had, it was all for you. Not for the war. Not for Dumbledore's strategy or the prophecy or any of the other enormous things that kept trying to make you into a symbol rather than a person. You. The actual you. The one who laughed at everything and grabbed at everything and was impossibly alert from about 3 weeks old in a way that kept waking me up at night because I'd come to check on you and you'd just be lying there, watching. There are things Dumbledore knows about you that you deserve to know yourself. I'll tell you them properly, your father will add things, you'll work out which parts are his because they'll be accompanied by diagrams, but the most important thing first, you are not a weapon. You were never meant to be a weapon. If anyone has told you otherwise, or made choices for you on the basis that you were, then those choices were wrong and you are not bound by them. Harry stopped reading for a moment. He was looking at the wall across from him, which was plain stone, unremarkable. He wasn't crying. He was doing the thing he'd gotten very good at, which was feeling a large thing very precisely and then choosing what to do with it instead of letting it choose for him. He turned back to the letter. His mother wrote for 2 full pages. She told him about the Potter family magic, its warmth, its instinctive quality, the way it responded to emotion rather than purely to technique, which she said was why his father's defensive spellwork had always been better in situations where someone he loved was in danger. She told him about the Black family wards and why they were built the way they were, and that the family's reputation for darkness was, in her assessment, largely a matter of aesthetic preference for formal magic over warm magic, and that formal didn't mean dark, whatever people said. She told him that she'd been researching the Peverell connection for 2 years and had gotten further than she'd expected, and that her notes were in the library vault under a personal seal that would open to his magical signature. She told him that Sirius was the best possible godfather and that she trusted him with everything, and that if Harry ever got to know him, he should let himself, because Sirius would love him ferociously, and that kind of love was not common and should not be wasted. She told him she loved him in a way that made the page slightly difficult to read at the corners, which had nothing to do with the quality of the ink. His father took over at the bottom of the second page. "Right, your mum has graciously left me the postscript spot, which is honestly the best spot because I can say what I want. Several things. 1, yes, we named you after both our best friends and I stand by it, the name is great, Lily lost a bet, I'm not telling you which one. 2, the disc. Bronze, slightly battered looking, probably wondering why you haven't touched it yet. It's a communication token. Match. Enchantment is Lily's work, so it's more sophisticated than anything I'd have managed. It's linked to a second disc that we gave to a trusted contact before we went into hiding. If that person is still alive and still has it, touching it with intent to communicate will reach them. I can't tell you who it is in a letter because if this letter is intercepted that makes it dangerous, but you're smart enough to figure it out, and if you've been to the vault you'll have seen the family documentation and you'll know the name. The clue is, I went to school with them, they were in Gryffindor, they were better at charms than me and I complained about it constantly, and your mother thought they were hilarious. 3. Dumbledore is brilliant and he has done a great deal of good, and I do not doubt that he believes in what he does. I also do not doubt that he has decided what your life should look like, and I think that a man who decides what your life should look like before you're old enough to decide it yourself is doing something wrong regardless of his intentions. I don't want you to hate him. I want you to understand him clearly, which is harder and more useful. 4. Your Quidditch instincts are genetic. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. I want a full report. 5. We love you more than the whole world is big enough to describe. Grow into yourself. Don't let anyone make you small. Dad. P.S. Your mum is crying. She's claiming she's not. She is. DPPS. He's terrible. L. Harry folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment, not moving. The room was very quiet. The food on the table had gotten cold. He picked up the bronze disc. Better at charms, Gryffindor, went to school with Dad. He knew the name. He'd read it in the family documentation that morning, listed as godfather, listed as designated guardian, listed as the person his parents had trusted absolutely. Sirius Black. But Sirius was in Azkaban. And if Sirius had the matching disc, Harry held the disc and thought Sirius with the same focus quality he'd used to sign the Lordship documents, something deliberate and directed, and the disc warmed in his hand. Stayed warm. Pulsed once, twice, a slow rhythm like waiting. He held it for 2 minutes. 3. Nothing. He put it in his pocket with the letter. If that person is still alive and still has it. Maybe Azkaban had its own wards against communication magic. Maybe the disc was gone, lost in 12 years of imprisonment. Maybe, he'd find out through the legal proceedings. He'd get Sirius out and then they could communicate in person, which was better anyway. He ate the rest of the sandwich, which was still objectively good even cold, and went back out into the corridor. Ragnarok was waiting for him. There is someone I'd like you to meet, the director said. He arrived this morning, which I admit I did not anticipate, but given the circumstances it seems appropriate. He is waiting in the secondary conference room and he is, I want to prepare you, somewhat emotional. Who is it? Neville Longbottom, Ragnarok said. His grandmother brought him in this morning for an unrelated consultation, and when our records flagged the connection, his family accounts have also been subject to irregular management, though the circumstances differ from yours, she insisted on remaining. He paused. She is a formidable woman. What's the connection between my accounts and his? The same guardian authority. Different mechanism. Ragnarok began walking and Harry fell into step beside him. Dumbledore is not Longbottom's guardian. But he holds a seat on the Hogwarts Board of Governors, and through a series of Wizengamot procedural motions cast with your proxy votes, it turns out, he established an oversight framework for the estates of families with incapacitated members. The Longbottom's accounts fall under that framework because Neville's parents are, in St. Mungo's, Harry said. He'd read it in the Black family documents, which had a brief entry on the Longbottoms as family allies. Frank and Alice Longbottom, Aurors, tortured to permanent incapacitation by Bellatrix Lestrange and associates. Neville's been effectively without parents his whole life. And his estate has been managed, under the framework Dumbledore created, by a board committee rather than by Augusta Longbottom alone. Ragnarok's voice was very dry. A committee whose decisions have consistently benefited various Order of the Phoenix-connected charities over the direct interests of the Longbottom heir. Harry stopped walking. He stole from Neville too. Not as directly as he stole from you. More, structurally. It is the difference between picking a pocket and redesigning the trousers so that things tend to fall out in a particular direction. Harry thought about that. Is that better or worse? It is, Ragnarok said, with what sounded like genuine respect for the question, a matter of perspective. The conference room was larger than the private lunchroom, with a long table and chairs on both sides and a window that looked out onto, Harry blinked, what appeared to be a courtyard that definitely shouldn't have fit inside the bank building, with a small tree in it that was doing something subtly wrong with its branches in the way of things that had been grown with magic rather than simply weather and soil. Augusta Longbottom was sitting at the table with the posture of someone who had sat at tables as an act of war for 50 years. She was older, sharp-faced, wearing robes that managed to be both sensible and slightly terrifying, with a hat that defied architectural gravity. She looked at Harry when he entered and assessed him in about 2 seconds flat. "Lord Potter," she said, and her voice was the kind of voice that had once commanded rooms before it was just impressive at tables. "Augusta Longbottom. My grandson." The boy sitting beside her was round-faced, slightly soft at the edges, with an expression of someone who was trying very hard to manage several feelings at once and not making a clean job of it. He was about Harry's height and had the kind of solidity that wasn't fat, exactly, just substantial, like he'd been built for endurance rather than speed. He was looking at Harry with what appeared to be a mixture of recognition, uncertainty, and something that wanted very badly to be hope. "Hi," Harry said. "Neville?" "Yeah." Neville Longbottom's voice was quiet and came out slightly strangled, like it had been cleared for speaking but not necessarily for this specific conversation. "Hi." Harry pulled out a chair and sat down. Not at the head of the table, across from Neville, at his level. He'd done it without thinking and then noticed that Augusta Longbottom noticed, and that she approved. "Ragnarok says your accounts have been interfered with." "Our accounts," Augusta said crisply, "have been systematically underperforming for 9 years under a management structure that Albus Dumbledore created through Wizengamot motions that, as of this morning, we now know were cast with illegally held proxy votes." She placed both hands flat on the table. "Meaning the framework that allowed the interference with our accounts was itself illegal. Which means every decision made under that framework is contestable." "We're going to contest it," Harry said. "We are going to do considerably more than contest it," Augusta said, with the particular serenity of someone who has decided on a course of action and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Neville was looking between them. He had the expression of someone who had spent his whole life being told he wasn't quite enough and who was currently watching two people behave as though that story had never been real. I didn't know, he said. About any of it. Gran only told me this morning, when we got here and they showed us the documents. Neither did I, Harry said. I found out about 6 hours ago. Something shifted in Neville's face. 6 hours. Ragnarok showed up at my relative's house this morning. Did you know about any of it? The magical world? Before today. Bits. Harry leaned forward on the table. Enough to know something was being kept from me. Not enough to know what. Neville was quiet for a moment. Then, my gran always said I wasn't living up to my parents. My dad was, he was a really powerful wizard. An aura. She'd compare me and I could never, he stopped. Looked down at the table. I've been having trouble with magic since I started I haven't started yet, I'm starting at Hogwarts in September, but I had some early tutoring and nothing ever worked right. Gran thought it was me. Was it? Neville reached into the pocket of his robes and produced a wand. It was pale, slightly battered, clearly well used. This was my dad's. Gran said I should use it because it would honor him and because it had worked for a powerful wizard, so it should work for me. He set it on the table. But it's his wand. Not mine. Harry looked at the wand, then at Neville. He didn't say the obvious thing because Neville clearly already knew it and didn't need to hear it, he needed it confirmed. So you've spent however long struggling with magic because you were using the wrong wand. Yes, Augusta said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't the command register. It was lower. More honest. A mistake for which I bear responsibility. Neville looked at his grandmother. The look between them was complicated and clearly the surface of something much longer and deeper that they hadn't finished working through, but it was a look between two people who would work through it. Get a new wand, Harry said to Neville. Today, if we can arrange it. Ollivander's or equivalent. We have an arrangement with a wand maker, Ragnarok said from near the door, where he'd been quiet long enough that Harry had half forgotten he was there. She can see you this afternoon. Neville straightened slightly in his chair. Small adjustment, physically. Larger in other ways. Okay, he said, and it came out more solid than he'd sounded before. Augusta Longbottom looked at Harry across the table. You intend to pursue this formally? The Wisengamot hearings, the DMLE disclosure, the contest of the management framework, all of it, Harry said. Dumbledore will not simply accept, I know. He will present it as a misunderstanding. He will have explanations. He is very good at explanations. She paused. He will also have the support of the majority of the wizarding public, who regard him as the most trustworthy man in Britain. He probably is the most trustworthy man in Britain, Harry said. Except on this particular issue, where he's been systematically stealing from children for a decade, which is something the most trustworthy man in Britain presumably shouldn't do. He spread his hands. I'm not trying to destroy him. I'm trying to reclaim what's mine and get my godfather out of prison and make sure the same thing can't happen again. A pause. The destroying, if it happens, will be a consequence of accurate information reaching people who can act on it. That's not the same as destroying. Augusta Longbottom studied him for a long moment. Then she did something that Harry suspected she didn't do often. She smiled. James Potter's son, she said, like it was a verdict rather than an observation. And Lily Evans, Harry said. The smile sharpened into something more complex and more respectful. Yes, she said. More so, I think. They spent another 2 hours at Gringotts. The wand maker, a compact, silver-haired witch named Valeria Goshawk who arrived with a case of wands and the focused energy of someone who took their craft personally, worked with Neville for 40 minutes in the conference room while Harry watched, and the moment the right wand settled in Neville's hand the change was immediate and visible. Not performed. Not dramatic. Just the sudden quality of a person realizing that the resistance they'd been fighting their whole life wasn't universal gravity, just a badly fitted door. Neville cast a simple lumos and the light that came from the wand was warm and immediate and clearly his, shaped by his magic rather than imposed against it. He stared at it for about 4 seconds and then looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone exercising profound self-control. "Good," Harry said. "Shut up," Neville said, which was probably the most confident thing he'd said all day, and Harry grinned. They did their school shopping afterward. Ragnarok had arranged for a modified version of the Gringotts cart to bring them from the vaults with currency already allocated, and a clerk met them at the Diagon Alley entrance to facilitate the process. Diagon Alley was an entire sensory event on its own. Harry walked through it with the particular alertness of someone encountering something they've been waiting for without quite knowing it, the smell of the cauldron shop, the sound of owls from Elops, the window of Flourish and Blots with its tower of textbooks. He noticed the whispers. He noticed people looking. He'd been half prepared for that, but the whispers were more and the looks were more complicated than he'd expected. Some of them were the reverential kind, the boy who lived kind, which was old news to him from years of Aunt Petunia's tight-lipped evasions. But some of them were a different kind, the kind that contained something urgent and political, and he realized belatedly that the Gringotts disclosure had moved faster than he'd thought, or that someone in the bank had talked, because twice he saw people look at him with an expression that was something between "is it true" and "oh thank God." He bought his books at Flourish and Blots and was standing at the counter when someone said his name. "Potter." He turned. A boy about his age, pale blonde hair, expensive robes, flanked by 2 larger boys who were clearly there for furniture and intimidation purposes. The expression on the blonde boy's face was the specific expression of someone who had been raised to assume deference and was performing certainty to cover the fact that something about this particular interaction wasn't tracking the way he'd expected. Harry looked at him without any particular expression. "That's me. Draco Malfoy," the boy said. He extended a hand with the manner of someone bestowing something. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. We should talk about Hogwarts, what house you'll be sorted into, who you should be associating with. I can help you navigate things." Harry looked at the hand. Then back at Draco Malfoy's face. "I appreciate the offer," Harry said pleasantly, "but I'm fairly good at navigation." He turned back to the counter. A beat of silence behind him. "You might want to be careful," Draco said, and his voice had shifted slightly, still performing certainty, but there was an edge in it now, the edge of someone who is not accustomed to being turned away. "About who you trust. There are old families who've waited a long time to align themselves with the Potter name. You'll want to choose those alliances wisely." Harry paid for his books. Took the bag. Turned around. "You're Lucius Malfoy's son," he said. Not a question. He'd seen the name in the Black family documents. The Malfoy family were connected to the Black line through Narcissa, and the documents had included a fairly thorough accounting of Lucius Malfoy's political activities, some of which were the kind that a man who claimed to have been under the Imperious Curse had performed with remarkable enthusiasm and consistent personal benefit. "Your father voted for the Muggle-born Registration Act 3 years ago. He voted against Sirius Black's right to a hearing twice." He kept his voice entirely even. "You're right that there are old families who want to align with the Potter name. Your family would like to be one of them, because the Potter name has 4 Wisengamot seats and that's useful." Draco Malfoy's face had done several things during this speech. It was currently doing something complicated. "That's a very cold way of looking at it," Draco said, but the certainty was gone from his voice now, replaced by something more careful. "It's an accurate way," Harry said. "You're not necessarily your father. But you're going to have to decide that for yourself, not assume I'll decide it for you because you have good manners." He nodded. Genuinely, not sarcastically. "See you at school, Malfoy." He walked out of the bookshop. Neville caught up with him 2 doors down, slightly breathless, his new wand in his pocket and the expression of someone who has just watched something unexpected and is deciding how to feel about it. That was Draco Malfoy. Yes. His father is one of the most powerful men in the Ministry. Yes. Neville was quiet for a moment. You're not scared of that? No, Harry said, simply and without performance, because it was true. He wasn't scared of Lucius Malfoy or Dumbledore or the Wizengamot or the Whispers in Diagon Alley. Not because he was invincible but because he'd spent 11 years in a cupboard learning that fear was useful when it pointed to something real and useless when it was just about other people's comfort with power. Are you? Neville thought about it with a seriousness that Harry was already beginning to recognize as characteristic. I think, Neville said slowly, that I've been scared of a lot of things. But I had the wrong wand. He touched his pocket. Maybe some of the other things were wrong too. Probably, Harry said. Let's find out. They stopped at Madame Malkin's for robes. They were in the middle of being measured when the bell above the door rang and Harry looked up in the mirror and saw a girl come in with her parents, both of them clearly Muggle, wearing the particular expression of people who were trying to appear more comfortable with their surroundings than they actually were. The girl was about their age, with a large quantity of brown hair and an expression of absolute ferocious interest in everything around her, which meant she was cataloguing Madame Malkin's shop with the same intensity that she was probably cataloguing everything she'd seen today. She stopped when she saw Harry in the mirror. Not the boy who lived stop. Something different. She'd clearly noticed Neville first, then Harry, and her expression was the expression of someone doing rapid social calculations while also being annoyed at themselves for doing rapid social calculations when there were interesting things to look at. You're going to Hogwarts, she said, which wasn't a question because she'd seen the school robes. September, Harry confirmed. Me too. She stepped up onto the fitting platform beside him while Madame Malkin moved to take her measurements, and somehow she managed to vibrate with contained energy even while standing still. I'm Hermione Granger. I've read all the textbooks already. Both years ahead of first, actually, and I've started on third-year theory because the foundational charms framework in the standard curriculum doesn't really build the way. She stopped herself, apparently with effort. That's probably too much. I do that. Sorry. Harry Potter, Harry said. And you can keep going, I wasn't bored. Really? She looked at him with something between surprise and assessment. Then she looked at Neville. Who are you? Neville Longbottom, Neville said, and said it without apology, which was new. Hermione's expression did something quick and subtle, cross-referencing, cataloging. The Longbottoms are a really significant wizarding family. Ancient line. Did you know your family had a specialist in herbology magic in the 19th century who completely reclassified how magical plants are taxonomized? Professor Sprout's entire approach to practical herbology is based on, I did not know that, Neville said, with a feeling that was almost visible in his face, like someone lighting a match in a dark room. Well. Hermione turned to Harry. And everyone knows who you are. But that's not. She stopped again, and this time she looked directly at him rather than around him, which Harry had already noticed was a thing that some people couldn't quite manage. You don't want to talk about that part, I'd guess. I don't mind it, Harry said. I just don't want it to be the only part. Completely reasonable, Hermione said briskly. So what are the other parts? Harry laughed, which was genuine and surprised even him slightly. I'm working on figuring that out, he said honestly. Today's been a lot. I've been reading about the wizarding world since March, Hermione said, accepting this. I have a very organized system of notes. If they'd be useful, they'd be very useful, Harry said. Hermione smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been waiting to be useful in the specific way they were best at and was deeply relieved to be asked. It was a good smile. Outside, after they'd paid and said goodbye to Hermione and her parents, with an agreement to find each other on the train, Neville walked beside Harry in the afternoon sun and said, She's going to be extraordinary. Yes, Harry agreed. She's also going to read every book in the library vault if you ever tell her it exists. Definitely, Harry said. He was already looking forward to it. They parted ways at the end of Diagon Alley, Neville back with his grandmother, who had spent the afternoon with Bonewright going through the Longbottom account documentation with the focus of a woman who intended to build a legal case that would outlast her opponents, which, given her apparent constitution, seemed likely. Harry watched them go and then stood for a moment at the junction of Diagon Alley and the Leaky Cauldron, with his school books in his bag and his parents' letter in his pocket and the bronze disc warm against his hip. The afternoon light was doing something golden to the cobblestones. He thought about Dumbledore. Not with anger, the anger was there, steady and controlled, a fire in a properly built fireplace rather than one in the middle of a wooden floor. He thought about his father's words. I want you to understand him clearly, which is harder and more useful. He thought about a man who had built an entire philosophy around the idea that the greater good justified individual cost, and who had looked at a 15-month-old boy and decided that cost was acceptable. He thought about what it would be like to walk into Hogwarts as himself, fully, completely himself, not the boy who lived and not the humble orphan and not any of the shapes other people had cut the space into. Just Harry, Lord of 4 houses, his mother's eyes and his father's instincts and 10 years of quiet, careful attention to the world, coming through a door for the first time. He was ready for it. He went back through the Leaky Cauldron and out into Muggle London and took the tube back toward Surrey, because the goblins had offered transport and he'd said he'd find his own way, because finding his own way was something he was going to need to practice. On the tube, pressed between a man reading a folded newspaper and a woman with a toddler who kept trying to touch Harry's bags, he reached into his pocket and held the bronze disc. It was still warm. As the train went underground, somewhere under the city, the disc pulsed once. Harry sat up straight. Twice. 3 times. A rhythm, irregular but deliberate, not mechanical warmth. Someone on the other end, tapping. He tapped back once, sharply, with his thumbnail. Silence. Then 3 long slow pulses. Then nothing. The tube rattled on. The toddler grabbed Harry's bag and was quietly redirected by her mother. The man with the newspaper turned a page. The world went on being entirely ordinary. Harry closed his fingers around the disc and held it tight all the way back to Surrey, and the whole way home, not home, he corrected himself, the house, home was somewhere he was going to build, the disc stayed warm in his hand. Not just residual heat. Someone, somewhere, knew he was there. He got off the train at the right stop and walked the familiar streets with his school supplies in bags that felt heavier than their contents accounted for and lighter than anything he'd carried before, and when he got back to Privet Drive and turned the key in the lock and went inside, his aunt was in the kitchen and she'd clearly been waiting. There was tea on the table. 2 cups. Harry looked at the cups. Looked at his aunt. He sat down. Right, Petunia Dursley said, in a voice that was doing its best impersonation of control, I think it's time I told you some things. She wrapped both hands around her mug. About your mother. About what she told me. About what I know. She looked at him and she was frightened and she was doing it anyway. All of it. Harry picked up his tea. All right, he said. Tell me. Chapter 3, The Sorting of Knives. The Hogwarts Express left at 11. Harry was on the platform at 10:15, which gave him 45 minutes to stand on platform 9 3/4 and understand, in a physical and immediate way, that he had been missing something enormous for his entire life. The train itself was ridiculous. Scarlet and gleaming, breathing steam that caught the late summer light and turned it gold. The platform was full of families, the noise of them, the color of them, robes and trunks and owls in cages and children running and parents holding on a second too long. He stood at the edge of it with his trolley and his trunk and Hedwig's cage and watched the whole thing with the particular attention of someone encountering something they'd been owed for years and were finally collecting. Neville found him first. He came through the barrier with Augusta beside him, who was managing the transition from Muggle corridor to magical platform with the ease of decades and steering Neville's loaded trolley with one hand while maintaining an expression that suggested she found the chaos of the platform mildly beneath her but would endure it. She said goodbye to Neville with a grip on his shoulder that lasted 3 seconds and communicated more than most speeches, then looked at Harry with the crisp nod of a general acknowledging an ally, and then she was gone. Neville's new wand was in his pocket and he was standing up straighter. Not performing it. Just doing it, the way you stand when the ground under you is solid. Ready? Harry asked. Getting there, Neville said honestly. Hermione arrived at 10:35 with both parents, who were Muggle dentists named Dan and Emma Granger and who had clearly decided that the best way to handle the fact that their daughter was going to a magical school was to treat it with the same interested pragmatism with which they would approach any unfamiliar professional environment. They asked Harry and Neville sensible questions about what the school was like, which Harry answered with the admission that he hadn't been yet either, which they found reassuring in a way that probably said something about the nature of first-day anxiety regardless of whether magic was involved. Hermione hugged them both with the focused intensity of someone who had allocated a specific quantity of time to this activity and intended to use all of it, then turned to Harry and Neville with red-rimmed eyes that she was clearly not acknowledging. Right, she said. I've made a list of things I want to look up in the library first week. Do either of you know if the Hogwarts library has the Flamel archive? I genuinely have no idea, Harry said. I'll just have to check, she said, and pulled out a notebook and wrote something in it, which seemed to make her feel better. They found a compartment near the middle of the train. The windows were slightly fogged and the seats were worn in the way of things that had been used for a very long time by a very large number of people, which Harry found oddly comfortable. He put Hedwig's cage on the luggage rack and she surveyed the compartment with the expression of an owl who had opinions about travel arrangements and was reserving judgment. The train moved at 11 exactly, and Harry watched the platform slide away and felt London dissolve into countryside and then into the particular quality of landscape that seemed to exist specifically for train journeys, hills and hedgerows and the occasional village gone past before you could read the signs. The door opened around noon and a boy put his head in, red-haired, freckled, the same general construction as someone who came from a large family and had spent years negotiating space. He looked hopeful and slightly anxious and said, "Anywhere to sit? Everywhere else is basically full." "Come in," Harry said. Ron Weasley, as it turned out, had 6 brothers and 1 sister, had been to Diagon Alley more times than he could count, had grown up knowing about Harry Potter the legend and was currently managing the cognitive adjustment required to reconcile that with Harry Potter the actual person sitting across from him, which he handled by talking about Quidditch at great length and with genuine passion, which Harry appreciated. He also had a rat called Scabbers who sat on his knee and looked faintly suspicious of everything, and a chess set he produced from his trunk and proceeded to use to demolish all 3 of them in under 10 minutes each, which was impressive enough that even Hermione, who took losing at anything as a personal challenge, seemed more interested than irritated. "You're really good," Harry said. "Only thing I'm better at than my brothers," Ron said, without particular bitterness, just fact. "Fred and George have each other, Bill's brilliant at everything, Charlie's got dragons, Percy's got his ambition. I've got chess." He reset the board. "Want another go?" "Yes," said Harry, because the honest answer was the better one, and also because he was already working out what he'd done wrong. The trolley came. Harry bought a quantity of food that would have taken his breath away a month ago and distributed it without fanfare across all 4 of them, which Ron tried to decline and Hermione tried to count calories on before visibly deciding she wasn't going to do that, and Neville accepted with a simple thank you that communicated clearly that the gesture had landed. Somewhere past the Scottish border, the light going amber outside the windows, a different kind of visitor appeared. The door opened without knocking. 2 boys and a girl, Slytherin green in their clothes already, though they weren't supposed to be sorted yet, just wearing it the way you wear the color of a team you've decided to support regardless of the outcome. The girl was Pansy Parkinson, who looked at the compartment with the assessment of someone establishing a social hierarchy in real time. One of the boys was Blaise Zabini, who looked mostly uninterested in everyone. The other was Draco Malfoy. Draco looked at Harry with an expression that had clearly been prepared in advance. "Potter," he said. "Reconsidered my offer?" "No," Harry said pleasantly. "You're sitting with a Weasley," Draco said, with a precision that suggested this was the most damning evidence he could present. Ron went very still beside Harry with the practiced stillness of someone who had heard his family name used as an insult before and was deciding what to do about it. I'm aware, Harry said. Ron Weasley. Good at chess. You. Draco blinked. Off script. What? Are you good at anything specific? Besides the entrance thing, which is decent. Harry nodded at the doorway. You've got good posture. Pansy Parkinson made a sound that might have been a laugh swiftly converted into something else. Zabini looked marginally more interested. Draco's jaw did something. I'm going to be in Slytherin, he said. Probably, Harry agreed. Most of the great dark wizards were. He said it without any particular charge on either word. Also several of the most interesting people in wizarding history. Ambition's useful. It's what you aim it at. He tilted his head. What do you want, Malfoy? Actually want? The question landed oddly, clearly not what Draco had come here for. He stood in the doorway and for just a moment his performance slipped and underneath it was something more honest, a boy who wanted to matter in the right ways and had only been given one set of instructions for how mattering worked. I want, he stopped. Collected himself. We'll see how the sorting goes, he said, and left. Pansy Parkinson gave Harry one very sharp look on her way out that communicated, without words, that she was watching. The compartment resettled. What was that? Ron said. I don't know yet, Harry said. But it's more interesting than I expected. Hermione, who had been watching the whole exchange with the focused attention of a naturalist documenting something new, wrote something in her notebook and said nothing. They changed into robes as the light failed completely outside and Scotland became a darkness punctuated by the occasional ghost of a hill. Harry was buttoning his robes when he felt the familiar warmth in his pocket, the bronze disc, pulsing. He pressed his thumb against it once, then twice, and it pulsed back with a pattern that had been getting more coherent over the past 3 weeks. Not words, not yet. But rhythm with intention in it. He was working on a theory about Azkaban's wards. Bonewright had confirmed that standard communication magic was dampened in the prison, but that objects with deep family enchantments on them operated on a different channel, one rooted in blood magic rather than standard spellwork. The disc might be getting through not because it was bypassing the wards but because it was running under them. He'd asked Bonewright to look into it. Bonewright had said interesting in the tone of a goblin who had found a new puzzle, which was the closest thing to enthusiasm he appeared capable of. The train slowed. Windows filled with the darkness of Scottish countryside and then the lights of Hogsmeade and then the castle itself, and Harry pressed his face to the glass with every other first year on the train because the castle was, there was simply no other word available, enormous. Not just tall. Deep. Ancient in the way that the Gringotts vault had been ancient, that quality of something that had been doing its specific job for so long it had become the landscape rather than just occupying it. Oh, Hermione said softly beside him, which was the most understated reaction she'd produced all day and therefore the most genuine. The boats across the lake were cold and dark and smelled of water and magic, and Harry sat in a boat with Neville and felt the castle get larger as they approached and thought about his parents crossing this same lake in these same boats, his father gesticulating, probably, his mother watching the castle with those green eyes, and the thought was sad and also good, the way things can be both of those simultaneously when you've had time to build the right kind of relationship with grief. Professor McGonagall met them at the entrance. Harry had read about her. Gringotts had included a staff briefing in his pre-Hogwarts documentation, which was either very thorough or slightly paranoid and Harry appreciated it either way. She looked exactly like her reputation, precise, fair, with the underlying warmth of someone who cared deeply about doing things correctly because doing things correctly was how you showed you cared about the people things were done for. She also looked at Harry when she collected them with an expression that had something in it beyond the standard first-year assessment, something that knew more than it was showing, something that had been waiting. She led them to a small chamber off the Great Hall and told them the sorting would begin momentarily. Harry stood among the crowd of first years and felt the magic of the castle in his bones, literally, physically, a resonance that was clearly responding to something in him the way a chord responds to a matching note. It was subtle. He suspected none of the others felt it. He glanced at Neville, who was looking at the walls with his hands slightly away from his body in the way of people who can feel something and aren't sure yet what it means. Neville felt it too. Not the same as Harry's, different quality, different frequency. But something. The ghosts came through the wall. Harry noted them with interest. A nearly headless one. A fat one in monk's robes. A grey lady who floated slightly apart from the others and caught Harry's eye and held it for just a moment before the procession continued, and Harry filed her away because there was something in that look that was more than a ghost being curious about a new student. McGonagall led them into the Great Hall. Harry had braced himself for the ceiling, because Hermione had told him about it 3 times on the train, enchanted to reflect the sky outside, bewitched ceilings, a history of magical architecture, 3rd printing, chapter 7, but being braced and being prepared were different things. It was stars. A genuine field of stars, more than you could see in any city sky, sharp and particular and directly above them, and the candlelight below was warm against the vastness of it, and the whole thing was exactly what a school that had been teaching magic for 1,000 years should look like, and Harry understood in his bones why generations of children had come through these doors and decided this was theirs. The Sorting Hat sat on a stool. It sang. The song was more specific than Harry had expected, not just the 4 houses but a verse near the end that felt like it was aimed at something, a warning or an appeal or possibly both, about what happened when the houses divided rather than combined. Harry watched the hat, and the hat's brim twitched briefly in his direction while it was singing, and he had the distinct impression it knew he was there. Names were called alphabetically and Harry waited. Hermione was sorted into Gryffindor with a speed that suggested the hat had decided in roughly 3 seconds and was satisfied with itself. She went to the table with a stride that was trying very hard not to look triumphant and mostly succeeded. Neville was called, and Harry watched him walk to the stool with his new wand in his pocket and his shoulders back, and when he put the hat on the table went quiet for a moment that stretched and then the hat called Gryffindor and Neville walked to the table with an expression of someone who'd been told something they'd needed to hear for a long time. Draco Malfoy was Slytherin before the hat touched his head. Ron Weasley, looking simultaneously resigned and genuinely fine about it, was Gryffindor in about 15 seconds. Then McGonagall said, "Potter, Harry," and the Great Hall went to a completely different quality of quiet. Harry walked to the stool. He was aware of all 4 house tables watching. He was aware of the staff table, where Dumbledore sat at the center, tall, silver-bearded, in robes of deep blue, and watched with the expression of a man who was entirely in control of his context. Harry met his eyes for just a moment before sitting on the stool, and what he saw in them was what his father had written about: intelligence, certainty, and an absolute conviction that everything was proceeding as it should. Harry sat. "Put the hat on." "Well," said a voice that was inside his skull and also somehow very much its own specific presence, ancient and dry and amused in a way that had clearly survived 1,000 years of sorting children by developing a sophisticated relationship with irony. "Now this is interesting. What do you see?" Harry asked it, internally, in the voice he used for thinking precisely. "4," the hat said. "I've never had 4 this clearly before. Not simultaneous, not integrated, not, this is very unusual, young man. You're aware of that?" "I'm becoming aware of a lot of things," Harry said. Potter-Black-Peverell-Slytherin. The family magics are braiding together. That takes years normally, or this. A pause that felt contemplative. Gryffindor would be obvious. Your parents. Your instincts. Your particular brand of courage, which is not the loud kind but the relentless kind, which is honestly rarer and more dangerous. But there are other arguments. Ravenclaw could claim you by that mind. Slytherin could claim you twice over by blood and by the ambition you're pretending is just strategic thinking. "I'm not pretending," Harry said. "It is strategic thinking." "It is both," the hat said, with the satisfaction of something that had been doing this for a very long time and was enjoying the current example. "Here is what I'll tell you, and I'll say it plainly because you seem like someone who prefers plain. You will define what Gryffindor means for the next 7 years more than Gryffindor will define you." The house will shape you less than you will shape it. And that, a beat, something that was the hat's equivalent of warmth, is rare enough to be worth naming. Name it for the hall then, Harry thought. The hat laughed, which was an interesting sensation in someone else's skull. Gryffindor, it bellowed. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry took the hat off, set it on the stool, and walked to the table, and as he passed the staff table he glanced at Dumbledore again. The headmaster was applauding with everyone else, smiling with everything his face had available. But something had shifted in his eyes, controlled, but there. Recalculation. He'd expected this, Harry thought. He'd planned for this. But he was already adjusting variables, already managing outcomes. Harry sat down between Hermione and a second year who immediately tried to shake his hand. He'd worry about Dumbledore's recalculations after dinner. The feast was extraordinary. Harry ate with the unself-conscious focus of someone for whom extraordinary food was still a relatively new development in life and who intended to do justice to it. Ron had 3 plates of everything and provided a running commentary on the dishes that was both informative and oddly poetic. Hermione mostly ate while reading the notice about the restricted section that someone had left pinned to the Gryffindor notice board, which had been brought in with the first-year mail and she had claimed immediately. The restricted section, she said, without looking up, requires a signed teacher's note. I'm going to ask Professor McGonagall first week. What are you looking for? Harry asked. Ancient family magic theory, Hermione said, glancing up briefly. After everything you told me on the train about the inheritance, I want to understand the mechanics of how 4 separate house magics integrate in a single person. It's theoretically unprecedented, said a voice from across the table. A 5th year with a prefect badge had apparently been listening. Percy Weasley, Ron's brother, the ambitious one, Percy had the look of someone who was perpetually presenting their best face to an invisible panel of judges. But underneath the performance there was something genuine. He was actually interested, his fork paused mid-air, his eyes tracking the conversation with real engagement. Sorry, Percy said, composing himself. I don't mean to intrude. But I've read about multiple house inheritance. It's in old and forgotten bewitchments. The theory is that it hasn't happened since the founders' generation because the houses were deliberately designed to select, to separate, rather than combine. He paused. If someone carries all 4, it's not just unusual. Theoretically, it's what the castle was built for. What the founders anticipated. The table had gone slightly quieter around them. Harry ate a roast potato and thought about that. What do you mean, what it was built for? Percy leaned forward. For a moment he forgot to be a prefect and was just a boy who had read something extraordinary and wanted to talk about it. The founders built Hogwarts on the principle that magic had to be taught. That it couldn't just be inherited and left to develop wild. But they also built it with a specific magical architecture, the wards, the castle's own magic, that was designed to recognize when the convergence happened. When someone carried the inheritance of all 4 simultaneously. He glanced around, slightly self-conscious about the audience, but plowed on. The castle is supposed to respond to that. Support it. The magic in the walls it was doing something when I walked in, Harry said. Percy pointed at him. Yes. Exactly. Ron was staring at his brother with an expression that Harry couldn't quite categorize, not jealousy, exactly. Something more like surprise, the surprise of discovering that someone you'd written off as one kind of thing was also another. Hermione had her notebook out. I'm going to need that book, she said to Percy. Library, 3rd shelf on the left past the history section, Percy said immediately, and then seemed to realize he'd been helpful to a first year and adjusted his prefect expression back into place. It's in the general stacks. Not restricted. Thank you, Hermione said warmly, which clearly disarmed Percy considerably. After dinner, Dumbledore stood and the great hall went quiet. Harry had been waiting for this. He'd wanted to see how Dumbledore operated in his natural environment, the speeches, the announcements, the way he managed an audience. He watched the headmaster rise and felt the room's attention orient toward him like compass needles. It wasn't fear. It was something more complicated and more willing than fear. It was the attention of people who genuinely trusted this person, who had been given reasons to trust him over a long time, who associated him with safety and wisdom and the particular comfort of having a capable adult in charge. Harry understood it. He didn't dismiss it. That was important. Dumbledore's speech was warm and measured and carefully designed, the welcome, the jokes that weren't offensive but landed reliably, the house unity points, the annual reminder about the Forbidden Forest and Filch's list of prohibited items, delivered with just enough wryness to seem self-aware. He was magnificent at it. It was a performance in the highest sense, the kind that was better than ordinary reality by enough to be genuinely good. His eyes found Harry twice during the speech. Both times with the same expression, warm, fond, managing. On the third look, which Dumbledore maybe didn't intend to send but did, Harry met it steadily and held it. Something crossed Dumbledore's face. Not much. A flicker. Harry looked away first, but only because he'd made his point. McGonagall led the Gryffindors to the tower. The staircases moved, which was exactly as disorienting as it sounded and twice as interesting. The common room was everything the word common room promised and had never delivered anywhere else Harry had been, warm, red and gold, the kind of place that accumulated history in its furniture and its fire and its notice board. He stood in it for a moment after the other first years had been shown to the dormitories and felt the castle's magic again, that deep chord resonance, more pronounced now. The castle knew he was here. He wasn't imagining it. The dormitory had 5 beds. Harry's trunk was at the foot of his, Hedwig's cage on the windowsill where she immediately looked out at the grounds with the proprietary expression of an owl who had decided this was acceptable. Ron's trunk was at the next bed. Neville's across the room. 2 others, Seamus Finnegan, who had an infectious laugh and an interest in things that exploded, and Dean Thomas, who drew things on any available surface and was quietly and completely confident in himself in a way that Harry found instinctively impressive. Ron lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling with his hands behind his head. "So," he said. "So," Harry said. "You're some kind of, the goblins told you today that you're," Ron searched for phrasing. "You're Lord of everything, basically." "Not everything," Harry said. "For things. For quite large things." "Yes." Ron processed this with the equanimity of someone who had grown up in a family that approached the extraordinary with pragmatic acceptance. "And you've decided to actually do something about it?" "Yes." "And Dumbledore he's the headmaster," Harry said. "He's also someone who has a great deal to answer for." Both of those things are true simultaneously. Ron turned his head to look at Harry directly. "My dad works at the ministry. He thinks Dumbledore is the best of us. The greatest wizard of the age." He paused. "He also says that the greatest wizards are the ones whose blind spots are the biggest, because they've never had to question themselves." Harry looked at him. Ron Weasley was, he was realizing, considerably more observant than the initial impression of a chess-playing, food-appreciating, Quidditch-enthusing boy suggested. "Your dad sounds worth listening to." "Sometimes," Ron said, with the affection of someone who meant it completely. He turned back to the ceiling. "I'm in, by the way. Whatever you're doing. I don't know all of it yet and some of it is probably going to be mental and I'll probably complain about it, but I'm in." It was, Harry thought, one of the more straightforwardly excellent things anyone had said to him. "Good," he said. "I'll need a chess coach." Ron grinned at the ceiling. The first week of classes was a revelation. Not just because the magic worked, and it did, charms clicking into place with a naturalness that was clearly connected to the house magic settling in him, transfiguration requiring more deliberate focus but responding, defense against the dark arts triggering something deep and instinctive that he could feel in his hands when he worked, but because Hogwarts itself was teaching him things that the classes weren't. He explored. Not in the nervous, map-needed way of someone lost. In the deliberate way of someone who owned property and was getting to know it. The castle responded. He'd find corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves slightly in useful directions, rooms that he walked past at random that turned out to contain exactly what he'd been thinking he needed. He tested this deliberately on the third day, thinking clearly and specifically about the library vault his mother had mentioned, and found himself standing in front of a door he'd never seen before on the fourth floor that had a small brass plate that read Founder's Archive, staff only. He stood there for a moment. Then he put his hand on the door and it opened. Inside was a room about the size of a large study, shelved from floor to ceiling, the quality of light different from the rest of the castle, warmer, older, like light that had been in the room long enough to become part of it. He walked along the shelves slowly. Books that predated the standard curriculum. Manuscripts in Salazar Slytherin's own hand. He recognized the script from the Gringotts documents. A section in Godric Gryffindor's that was clearly a combination of spellwork theory and what appeared to be personal opinion on a wide range of subjects, delivered with the conviction of someone who was never going to doubt themselves. And in the middle of the room, a locked cabinet that opened when he touched it, because of course it did. Inside, on a velvet stand, was a small journal. Green leather. Old enough that the cover had worn to a deep softness. On the front, in gold letters that had faded to ghosts of themselves, property of Salazar Slytherin. Do not touch. Below that, in much newer ink, someone had added, unless you are the one it's waiting for. Harry picked it up. It was warm. Not the bronze disc warmth of family magic. Something older and more deliberate, like the warmth of something that had been waiting to be warm for a very specific person and had been doing so for a very specific number of years. He turned it over in his hands and then opened it to the first page. The page was blank except for 3 words. You're quite late. Harry laughed. He sat down on the floor of the Founder's Archive and opened the journal to the next page and began to read, and the castle settled around him with the particular quality of something that has finally, after a very long time, been allowed to do what it was built for. He was there for an hour before he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He closed the journal and tucked it under his robes. Stood. Composed himself. The door opened. Dumbledore stood in the doorway. He was wearing robes the color of deep water and his expression was warm and he looked at Harry the way someone looks when they've found what they were looking for and are deciding how to react to it. Harry, he said. I wondered where you'd got to. Harry looked at him. The warm fireplace inside him was very steady. Professor. This room is generally staff access only. He stepped in, glancing at the shelves with what appeared to be casual interest but was clearly inventory. The castle has a tendency to misbehave with the door wards when something catches its interest. He smiled. How are you settling in? Very well, Harry said. Good, good. The wandering gaze settled back on Harry, gentle and attentive. I've been hoping to have a word with you. In my office, perhaps, when you have a moment. There are things I'd like to discuss, your first year, settling in, your particular circumstances. The last 2 words were handled carefully, wrapped in warmth to take the edge off. I'd like you to know that I'm available to you, Harry. Whatever you need. Harry stood very still and looked at the most powerful wizard in Britain and felt the whole architecture of everything he'd learned in the past 3 weeks pressing behind his eyes, his parents' letter, the vault documents, the account maps with their outflow channels, Sirius's disc pulsing in his pocket. He said, That's kind of you, Professor. I'll find a time. He smiled. Warm, open, entirely manageable. He'd learned the expression from watching Dumbledore use it from across the Great Hall, which seemed like an appropriate origin. Something moved behind Dumbledore's eyes. The same flicker as the Great Hall. Faster this time, and followed by something that was the beginning of concern wearing the clothing of thoughtfulness. He's starting to understand, Harry thought. Not what I know. Not yet. But that I'm not what he expected. Good, Dumbledore said, and smiled back, and neither of them were entirely performing and neither of them were entirely not. The castle has always liked the Potter family, Dumbledore added, gesturing at the room around them. I hope you'll feel at home here. I already do, Harry said, which was the most honest thing he'd said all day. He walked out of the Founder's archive and back into the corridor, and the door closed behind him with a click that sounded, just slightly, like a lock. He didn't look back. The next morning brought potions, which was Professor Snape's, and Snape was exactly as much of an experience as the castle documents had prepared Harry for, and then considerably more, because documents couldn't quite communicate the particular quality of Snape's presence, the way he moved through the dungeon classroom like something between a professor and a weather event, the voice that seemed to carry even at low volume, the black eyes that catalogued everything. He began class by asking questions of the first years with the specificity of someone testing not just knowledge but nerve. He called on Hermione twice and then cut her off both times, which Harry noted produced a very specific expression on Hermione's face that meant she was composing a response that was going to be, on some level, nuclear. Then Snape looked at Harry. Potter, he said. Our new celebrity. He let the pause do its work. Tell me. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Harry had read his potions textbook on the train. He'd also, to be fair, read 3 supplementary texts from the library vault, including one that was Lily Potter's personal annotated copy of Advanced Potion Making with notes in the margins that suggested his mother had opinions about Snape's textbook that were simultaneously very critical and deeply insightful. Draft of Living Death, Harry said. One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. Asphodel is in the lily family, which is part of why the combination works. The infusion needs a base compound with sufficient alkaloid depth to. Snape cut him off. Not with the dismissiveness he'd used on Hermione. With something more complicated. He looked at Harry for a moment with an expression that was clearly involuntary and clearly being controlled. Where the bezoar is found. Stomach of a goat. Universal antidote for most poisons. My mother's notes on the bezoar application suggest it's underused in first response situations because of the preparation time, but that the time investment is, your mother's notes, Snape said very quietly. The class had gone still. Harry met his gaze directly. Not provocatively. Not performing. Just looking, the way you could look at someone when you weren't afraid of what you'd find there. She had an annotated copy of the advanced text. I've been reading it. The silence in the dungeon was a specific quality of silence. Snape stood very still for a moment that lasted several seconds and contained what Harry suspected was a very complicated internal event. Then he said, in a voice that was flat and controlled and gave nothing away except for the specific quality of its flatness, which gave quite a lot away to someone paying sufficient attention, the monkshood and wolfsbane question. Same plant, Harry said. Aconite. Poison in root form, useful in potion form for werewolf treatment, wolfsbane potion, though that 7th year and my mother's notes suggest the standard formulation has a flaw in the 3rd step that causes instability under certain temperature conditions. He paused. She had a theory about the fix. I haven't tested it. Snape looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned away. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said, which was clearly dragged out of him by the pure principle of not punishing accurate information, and which produced a sound from the Slytherin half of the class that suggested this was unprecedented. Begin reading page 24. Do not touch the ingredients until I tell you. Harry began reading page 24. Neville, who had been braced throughout the exchange, let out a breath beside him. That went better than I thought, he murmured. He's complicated, Harry murmured back. He knew my mother. He hated your father. Yes. Harry turned a page. Those 2 things aren't as contradictory as they seem. Neville considered this. Then, quietly, your mum's notes. Do you think she'd mind if, herbology overlaps with potions quite a bit, and if she had thoughts on plant-based compounds, I'll get you a copy, Harry said. She'd have wanted you to use them. Neville went back to his textbook, and the slight color in his face was not embarrassment. It was something warmer than that. Across the dungeon, at the Slytherin side of the room, Draco Malfoy was watching Harry with the expression he'd been wearing since the sorting, the one where his prepared responses kept not fitting the actual situation and he was running continuous revisions. Pansy Parkinson was taking notes. Zabini was doing something subtle with a lacewing fly that he'd apparently smuggled in, and when he caught Harry noticing he just raised an eyebrow, which Harry returned. Slytherin was going to be more interesting than advertised. Most things were. The week ended on Friday with a letter. Official Gringotts paper, delivered by a very small and very efficient owl that landed on Harry's cereal bowl at breakfast and departed immediately without waiting for a reply or a treat, which made Ron look at his own owl Errol with the loving despair of the chronically patient. Harry read the letter without expression. When he was done he folded it and put it in his pocket and picked up his spoon. "Well?" Hermione said. "Amelia Bones at the DMLE has received the audit disclosure," Harry said. "She's opened an investigation. The Wisingamot hearing for the Peverell claim is scheduled for the end of October." He ate a spoonful of cereal. "And Sirius Black's case has been flagged for review by the Office of Aura Investigations, which means someone is looking at the trial that never happened." The table around him was the usual Friday morning chaos of post and food and the Weasley twins creating a small but significant incident involving what appeared to be a self-rolling pastry 2 tables down. Ron was watching Harry with the focused attention of someone who had agreed to be in and was monitoring how things were going. "Is it moving fast enough?" Neville asked. He'd been waiting for this letter too. "Faster than Dumbledore expected," Harry said. "Slower than I'd like." He looked down the table at the Gryffindor crowd, at the faces of his housemates eating breakfast in the castle that was already beginning to feel like his, in the world that was already, piece by piece, coming into accurate focus. "But we're moving." Down the staff table, Dumbledore was eating his breakfast and reading a letter of his own. His expression, Harry noted, had acquired a new quality over the past week. It was still warm. Still managing. But underneath the management, something was working, recalculating, adjusting, preparing. "The greatest wizards are the ones whose blind spots are the biggest," Ron's father had said, because they've never had to question themselves. Harry ate his cereal and thought, well. Here's your question. The castle's resonance hummed in the walls around him, ancient and ready, waiting to see what he'd do next. He had several ideas. Chapter 4, The Letters in the Fire. October arrived in Scotland the way it always did, without apology, replacing September's last warmth with something sharper and more honest. The grounds went gold and then red and then the particular brown of things that have finished being beautiful and are now just being real. The lake went dark. The forest thickened at its edges. The castle, if anything, seemed to draw itself tighter and more present, like a living thing settling in for winter. Harry had been at Hogwarts for 6 weeks and he had learned several things. The first was that the Slytherin Journal was extraordinary. He read it every night before sleep, sitting on his bed with the curtains drawn and a quiet Lumos, working through Salazar Slytherin's cramped and sometimes sidewinding prose with the focused patience his mother had apparently passed to him genetically. It wasn't a spell book, not exactly. It was something closer to a philosophical text with practical applications threaded through it, Slytherin's actual views on magic, on inheritance, on the nature of power, which turned out to be considerably more nuanced and considerably less villainous than the portrait the wizarding world had painted of him. He believed in selective teaching, yes, but his argument was about readiness, about magical stability, not about blood. His entries on the Founder's arguments read like the journals of 4 people who genuinely loved each other and disagreed on nearly everything and made something extraordinary from the tension of it. There was an entry near the middle of the journal, dated in a system Harry couldn't fully translate, that read, "Godric says I am afraid of what I cannot control." He is correct. The difference between us is that he considers this a flaw and I consider it a reasonable response to the available evidence. Harry had read that entry 4 times. The second thing he'd learned was that Hogwarts itself was teaching him magic that no class offered. Not dramatically, not secret rooms full of advanced spell work, though the Founder's archive was proving deeply useful. More subtly. The castle's resonance had started responding to his intent in ways that went beyond door wards and useful corridors. When he was in Transfiguration working through a particularly complex theory, the castle's ambient magic seemed to settle around him and clarify things, the way a tuning fork clarifies pitch. McGonagall had noticed. She hadn't said anything directly, but she'd started calling on Harry for the more complex demonstrations, and the look she gave him after each one was adding new layers every week. The third thing was Snape. Snape had not become warm. Snape had not become easy. What Snape had become was something more complicated and more interesting than either of those things. He had started leaving books on Harry's desk at the beginning of potions. No note. No acknowledgement. Just a book, once a week, always on a topic that was somehow exactly relevant to something Harry had been thinking about. The first had been an advanced text on compound potion theory. The second was a monograph on alkaloid-based antidotes. The third, which arrived at the beginning of October, was a slim volume Harry didn't recognize, handwritten, no author listed on the spine, and when he opened it he found marginalia in his mother's handwriting responding to marginalia in another hand that, after a page, he recognized as Snape's. He sat with that book open on his lap for a long time before he put it carefully in his bag. After class, when the dungeon had emptied, he went back. Snape was at his desk. He didn't look up. Potter. This was hers, Harry said. He put the book on Snape's desk. Snape looked at it with his hands flat on the desk surface on either side of it. His face was doing what Snape's face did, which was perform neutrality over a geological formation of actual feeling. It was both of ours, he said, after a moment. We wrote it together. In 5th year. A pause. I thought it had been lost. It was in the library vault. With her other things. Snape said nothing. She annotated everything, Harry said. The advanced potions text, the Bezoar entries, the theory on alkaloid compounds. She was right about the wolfsbane instability, wasn't she? You've been thinking about the same fix. Snape looked up then. The black eyes did something complicated. She was frequently right about things, he said, which was the most honest statement Harry had ever heard him make, and it came out with the specific quality of something that had been stored in the dark for a long time. Harry left the book on his desk and walked out. He didn't have a strategy with Snape. He just kept treating him like someone who was both difficult and worth the difficulty, which was the only thing he could think to do that his mother would have approved of. The fourth thing he'd learned was about Quirrell. Professor Quirrell taught defense against the dark arts with a stutter that appeared and disappeared depending on what was being discussed, present when he was performing nervousness, absent when he forgot himself in the material, which happened most often when the subject turned to the dark arts themselves, to Voldemort's techniques, to the theory of possession and dark enchantment. Harry had noticed the inconsistency in the second week. By the third week he'd started paying attention to the back of Quirrell's turban, which seemed to produce a headache in Harry's scar when he sat too close for too long. He hadn't said anything about it yet. He was watching. What he had done was write to Bonewright at Gringotts, framing it as a theoretical question about possession detection and asking for any relevant documentation. Bonewright had responded with a monograph on the subject and a brief addendum noting that the goblins had, for professional reasons, developed significant expertise in identifying magical presences that were attempting to conceal themselves, and that if Harry ever needed that expertise applied to a specific situation he should indicate as much. Harry had written back indicating as much. A reply was pending. The fifth thing, the most important thing, was the hidden messages. He'd found the first one on a Tuesday evening in early October, sitting alone in the Gryffindor common room after everyone else had gone to bed, reading Slytherin's journal. He'd been thinking about his parents and the letter and what his father had written about choices and about Dumbledore, and he'd reached into his bag for his own notes and instead his hand had closed around a folded piece of parchment he had absolutely no memory of putting there. He'd unfolded it. It was in his mother's handwriting. Harry, if you're reading this you've been at Hogwarts at least a month, which means you've had time to settle and start understanding the place. Good. These messages are on a time-release charm I keyed to the castle's own magic. They'll appear in places you'll find them when the castle judges you're ready for the information. I know that sounds like I'm asking you to trust a building. I am. I helped reinforce these wards. The castle and I are on good terms. There is something hidden at Hogwarts that Dumbledore does not know exists. That is not a sentence I write carelessly. He knows almost everything. But this he doesn't know because I hid it after he told me it wasn't possible to hide anything from him in this castle, which was a reason to try. In the 7th floor corridor, across from the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy attempting to teach trolls ballet, walk past the blank wall 3 times thinking clearly about what you need. The room of requirement. It's older than the school. The founders knew about it. It will give you what you actually need, not always what you ask for, which sounds frustrating but is usually right. What I've left there for you, the rest of my research on the Peverell line. My notes on the Deathly Hallows. Everything I found before October. Go when you're ready. Be careful with Dumbledore. Not afraid. Careful. There's a difference. Mum Harry had sat with that letter for a long time. Then he'd gone to the 7th floor. The room of requirement, as it turned out, was the most extraordinary space he'd yet encountered in a building full of extraordinary spaces. He'd thought clearly about his mother's research, walked past the wall 3 times, and the door had appeared with the specificity of something that had been waiting. Inside was a room that looked like a cross between a study and a library, comfortable, warm, lit by a fire that had presumably been burning since his mother enchanted it, with a desk at the center and on the desk a series of sealed journals and folders organized with the exact precision of someone whose mind worked in categories and connections simultaneously. Lily Potter's Peverell research was, Harry discovered over the following 3 weeks, extraordinary. She'd started from the Evans family genealogy and worked backward. She'd traced the dormancy in the magical line to a specific event in 1703, a marriage between a Peverell descendant and a Muggle that had been deliberate for a reason, the magical signature of the choice carrying the specific quality of protective concealment rather than accident. Someone in that generation had hidden the line. She'd spent 2 years finding out why, and what she'd found was documented in the 4th journal in language that Harry read 3 times to be sure he understood it correctly. The Deathly Hallows were not 3 separate objects that happened to belong to the same family. They were 3 components of a single magical working. The Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, the Cloak of Invisibility, each was keyed to a specific aspect of Peverell family magic. Separately, they were extraordinary. Together, in the hands of someone who carried all 3 aspects of that family magic genuinely rather than through theft or luck, they were something the wizarding world didn't have adequate language for. His mother had used the word complete and then crossed it out and written convergent and then crossed that out too and written, the closest analogy is a key, but that implies a door, and I think the analogy is actually closer to a person who has become entirely themselves. Harry sat in the room of requirement with that page open and felt the castle's resonance around him and thought about what it meant to be entirely yourself and whether he was there yet. Not yet. But closer than he'd been. His mother's final journal in the collection was the shortest. 20 pages, written quickly, the handwriting was less precise than her usual, suggesting urgency. The date on the first page was 2 weeks before she died. I've been thinking about the prophecy, she'd written. Dumbledore told us about it, or told us most of it, I suspect he edited. The relevant line is something about neither can live while the other survives, which is the kind of language that sounds definitive until you think about what survive actually means. I've been thinking about it. Here is what I think, Voldemort is not going to stop. We've known this. The protections around Godric's Hollow are strong but not permanent. Nothing is permanent when someone is actively working against it. What I've been working on is something that won't fail. Not a ward. Not a charm. Something more fundamental. I don't know if it will work. I know the theory is sound. I know that sacrificial magic of the right kind, offered freely, with full knowledge, for pure protective intent, creates a counterforce that no dark magic can penetrate, not because it's a stronger shield but because it operates on a different principle entirely. Dark magic works by taking. Sacrificial magic of this kind works by giving, which means there's nothing for the taking to take. If I'm right, and I am right, then Harry will survive whatever Voldemort does. And more than survive, the protection will mark him. Not hurt him. The opposite of hurt. It will give him something no one can take. I hope I'm wrong about needing to use it. I am not wrong about it working. Whatever happens, make sure he knows, the magic in him isn't borrowed. It isn't luck. I put it there on purpose, and it was the best thing I ever did with everything I knew. Harry closed the journal. He sat in the warm room his mother had built for him in a castle she'd loved, and he held the journal with both hands and let himself feel the full size of what she'd done with full awareness of the cost of it, and he didn't push it away or manage it or make it smaller than it was. He sat with it for a long time. Then he put the journal carefully with the others, stood up, straightened his robes, and walked back to the dormitory. In the morning he wrote 3 letters before breakfast. The first was to Ragnarok, updating him on the Quirrell situation and asking whether the goblin's possession detection expertise could be applied remotely with sufficient documentation, location, magical signature, observed symptoms. The second was to Amelia Bones at the DMLE. He'd been corresponding with her through a Gringotts intermediary since the audit disclosure, and they'd developed a carefully worded professional relationship in which she asked questions that sounded administrative and he provided answers that sounded factual, and both of them were building toward the same target from different angles. Today's letter contained something new: his mother's notes on the October 1981 timeline, specifically the entries that documented the state of the Fidelius charm and the secret keeper arrangement and the specific sequence of decisions that had led to Peter Pettigrew being chosen over Sirius Black. His mother had documented it all. She'd had doubts. She'd written them down. Peter was James's choice, she'd written, and I trusted James's instincts about his friends. But I noticed that the suggestion to switch came from Dumbledore, who argued that Sirius was too obvious. I notice also that I agreed, and that I didn't question it, and I'm documenting this now because I've learned that the things I don't question are usually the things I should. The third letter was to Sirius. He wrote it knowing it might not get through, knowing the disc was a better channel than written correspondence, but that he needed to put this in words that could be read. He wrote about his parents' vault. About the letters. About the room of requirement. About the research. He wrote she was extraordinary and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fact that his mother had been a real person doing real things with real love, and he had only just been given enough of the picture to understand the scale of it. He sealed the letter and addressed it to Sirius Black, HM Prison Azkaban, and then sat with it in his hand for a moment. Then he wrote on the outside of the envelope, below the address, in small letters, "Hold for delivery pending release proceedings." Because that was what was going to happen. He was going to make it happen. He sent all 3 with the school owls and went to breakfast. The hall was its usual morning self. Hermione arrived 30 seconds after him with a book open before she sat down, which was a new record. Ron appeared from somewhere looking like he'd been up since 5, which it turned out he had, because the Quidditch trials for the house team were tomorrow and he'd been worrying about it in the productive way that made sleep seem inadvisable. "I'm not trying out," Ron said, sitting down and immediately piling food onto his plate. "I just want to watch. Fred and George are playing, it'll be theatrical," Neville offered. "Dangerous," Hermione said, without looking up. "Brilliant," Ron said firmly. "Harry, you should try out." "He can't," Hermione said, still not looking up. "First years aren't, he's Lord of 4 houses," Ron said. "Is there actually a rule or is it just a tradition?" Harry considered it. He'd looked at a broom in Madame Hooch's flying lesson and felt something that he suspected was genetic, his body understanding the principle of it before his mind had fully processed the theory. He'd also, without particular effort, spent the entire flying lesson doing things that Madame Hooch had clearly not expected from a first year who'd never been on a broom, including a controlled dive at 15 feet that she'd told him to stop immediately in a voice that was 70% concern and 30% deeply interested. "I'll ask McGonagall," Harry said. He asked McGonagall after Transfiguration. She looked at him with the expression she used when she was trying not to show she'd already considered something, and then said that the rule was about age and experience, that there was no explicit prohibition on exceptional talent being assessed on its own merits, that she happened to know the Gryffindor Quidditch team had a seeker vacancy, and that she could arrange for a private trial tomorrow morning if he was interested, which she delivered with a briskness designed to conceal that she was pleased. "I'm interested," Harry said. He tried out the next morning, just him and the Gryffindor captain Oliver Wood, who was a sixth year with the focused fanaticism of someone for whom Quidditch was not a sport so much as a calling. Wood put a snitch in the air, told Harry to catch it, and then stood back and looked like someone who had been planning a speech and didn't need to give it. Harry caught the snitch in 4 minutes. He hadn't been racing against a time limit. He'd just been paying attention, which it turned out was most of what seeking required. The broom work was natural, instinctive, more about reading the air and the light and the direction of small disturbances than about technical skill. He landed, held the snitch out to Wood, and Wood looked at it and then at Harry and then at the sky, apparently consulting something. "Right," Wood said. "Right. Okay. Yes." "Is that a yes?" Harry asked. "That's a very emotional yes," Wood confirmed. He was on the team by noon. Ron was delighted with a completeness that bordered on personal vindication. Hermione cross-referenced the historical record on first-year seekers and found only 2 precedents, which she presented as a concern and then immediately started using to calculate Harry's projected statistical performance, which suggested she was less concerned than she appeared. October deepened. Leaves fell. Harry studied. He was good at magic, not in the effortful, worked-for way that was most common, though he understood effort and used it. He was good at it the way his father had apparently been good at it, which was instinctively and with a confidence that was less about arrogance and more about a functional relationship with his own capabilities. He knew what he could do. He was finding out what that was, and it was, so far, more than the curriculum required and considerably more than most people expected from a first year. His charms were exceptional. Flitwick had started giving him additional material without being asked, which was the most valuable compliment available from a man who taught by challenge rather than praise. His transfiguration was strong. His defense was something else. When they covered basic shielding charms in October, Harry's first cast produced something 3 times the standard size and anchored with the Black family's particular ward-building magic, which created a shield that felt less like a wall and more like a presence. Quirrell had looked at it from across the room with an expression Harry couldn't read at the time and thought about carefully later. The Quidditch match against Slytherin was scheduled for the 3rd Saturday of October. Harry was in the air for practice the Thursday before when the bronze disc in his pocket, he'd kept it with him, always, since September, went warm and then immediately urgent in a way it had never done before. Not the slow pulse of someone working through dampening wards. A rapid, sharp series that felt like tapping with intent. He landed. Not because practice was done but because this was more important. Back in the common room, quiet mid-afternoon, he sat by the fire and held the disc and let himself concentrate on it with full attention. The pulses came in short sequences. He worked out over about 10 minutes that it was a code, not Morse, something else, something built on the rhythm of 2 people who had passed messages since before Harry was born, and after another 20 minutes of attention the pattern resolved. 3 words. Repeated. "I hear you." Harry exhaled. He tapped back. Slow, deliberate, thinking the words as he tapped them. "I'm getting you out." Then, "Hold on." The disc stayed warm for a long time after that. Neville found him sitting by the fire still holding it, and sat down in the adjacent chair without asking what was happening, which was one of Neville's best qualities. He'd brought his herbology notes and spread them on his knee and worked through them with the quiet focus that had characterized everything he did since getting his proper wand. He was extraordinary at herbology, not just technically competent, genuinely gifted, with an understanding of magical plant interaction that Professor Sprout had twice pulled him aside to discuss privately, which had produced in Neville the expression of someone discovering a room in their own house they didn't know they had. After a while he said, without looking up from his notes, the hearing for the Peverell claim is in 2 weeks. I know, Harry said. Are you going? Yes. Ragnar's arranged a legal leave through the school governors. McGonagall knows. Neville nodded. Gran is coming. She said she's been waiting 15 years to walk into the Wizengamot with a proper case and she intends to be appropriately dressed. He paused. She bought a new hat. Good, Harry said. She also said, Neville stopped and started again in a slightly different register, something more personal. She said that my dad would have been, that he'd have been proud. That both of them would have been. He kept his eyes on his notes. I don't know them. I know about them. But it's different. Harry thought about a journal and a letter and 2 small portrait miniatures and the difference between knowing about someone and knowing them. It's different, he agreed. But what you know about them is still real. They're still real. What they did is still real. Neville was quiet. Your parents' things, the notes, the journals, does it help? Having that? Yes. Harry didn't dress it up. It helps a lot. It still hurts. Both of those things are true. Neville nodded slowly, absorbing this. She left notes on herbology, by the way, Harry said. My mom. In the potions text but also in a separate journal that covers plant-based compounds. Her section on nightshade variants is apparently, Sprout would probably find it interesting. Neville looked up. His face did the quiet thing that meant something was landing correctly. I'd like to read it. If that's all right. I'll get you a copy, Harry said. Same words as before. He meant them the same way. The week before the Wizengamot hearing, Dumbledore called Harry to his office. Harry had been expecting this. He went without making anyone aware of the meeting, which was a deliberate choice. If something went wrong, people knowing would come after. If nothing went wrong, the meeting would be more honest without the weight of audience on it. The office was exactly as much as advertised and then some. Circular, crammed with objects that were all doing things, portraits of previous headmasters who watched Harry come in with expressions ranging from interest to assessment to, in one case, something that looked like barely contained excitement. The sorting hat on its shelf gave Harry what he was fairly certain was a nod. Fawkes was on his perch. The Phoenix watched Harry with amber eyes that were warmer than anything else in the room, and when Harry paused to look at him, Fawkes made a sound, low, one note, something that vibrated in Harry's chest where his mother's protection magic lived. Harry, Dumbledore said, from behind his desk. Sit down, please. Harry sat. Dumbledore looked at him the way he always did, warm, attentive, managing, but there was something different about it tonight. The warmth was real, Harry thought. He believed that. The management was also real. The problem was that Dumbledore didn't seem to fully understand that warmth and management could be in fundamental opposition to each other. I understand, Dumbledore said, that you've been very busy since arriving at school. Your work in classes has been remarkable. Professor Flitwick speaks very highly. Professor McGonagall, a small smile, speaks precisely as highly and in a more measured register, which from her means the same thing. He folded his hands on the desk. I also understand that you've had some correspondence with Gringotts, and with the office of Madame Bones. Yes, Harry said. I wonder, Dumbledore said, gently, if you'd be willing to tell me about it. The Gringotts correspondence is about my accounts and my inheritance claims, Harry said. The Bones correspondence is about an investigation that the DMLE opened on the basis of the audit disclosure. Yes. Dumbledore's voice remained gentle. Nothing in his expression changed. He was handling this the way a very skilled person handles something delicate, careful grip, steady hands. Harry, I want to be honest with you. I've made decisions about your guardianship and your estate management that I believe were correct at the time and that I would characterize differently than the, rather stark language the Gringotts audit uses. How would you characterize them? Harry asked. Genuinely. He wanted to hear it. Dumbledore looked at him, and for a moment the managing layer was thinner than usual. I made choices for a child I could not consult, based on a situation that was unprecedented and dangerous. Your parents were dead. Sirius Black had been, imprisoned without trial, Harry said. Based on an accusation and no evidence, because nobody stopped to hold a trial. Do you know who had the authority to request a trial on his behalf? Dumbledore was quiet. His magical guardian would have, Harry said. If he'd had one who wasn't also the person who made the decision to imprison him. He kept his voice even. Not angry. Clear. I don't think you meant for it to work out the way it did. I think you were moving very quickly in a very bad situation and you made choices that served your priorities. I think your priorities were real priorities, the war, the order, rebuilding the wizarding world. I'm not dismissing them. Dumbledore looked at him with something new in his face. The managing layer had dropped further. Underneath it was something more honest and considerably more uncomfortable, a man who was not accustomed to being understood this accurately by anyone, let alone an 11-year-old, and who was finding the experience disorienting. But, Harry continued, real priorities don't automatically justify the cost of acting on them. My parents left a will. Sirius should have been tried. I should have grown up knowing who I was. He paused. None of that is about your intentions. It's about consequences. Harry, the Wisengamot hearing for the Peverell claim is in 11 days, Harry said. The Sirius Black case review is in progress at the DMLE. The audit disclosure covers everything I've just described and the financial irregularities as well. I'm not asking for your permission to pursue any of this. I'm telling you because you asked and because I think honesty works better than positioning. Dumbledore sat with that. It was a long moment. The office was very quiet except for the soft sound of the various instruments and Fawkes shifting on his perch. The portraits were all watching. Harry didn't look at them. He watched Dumbledore. The headmaster looked, for the first time since Harry had arrived in his office, like a man rather than a presence. Not diminished, he was still Albus Dumbledore, still extraordinary, still carrying the weight of the specific kind of intelligence that had made him the most important wizard of his generation. But the management had dropped and what was underneath it was something more human than the management allowed. He knew he'd been wrong. He didn't enjoy it. He was deciding what to do with it. I underestimated you, Dumbledore said finally. It came out simply, without the careful wrapping he normally put around difficult statements. Yes, Harry said. I think you've been doing that for a while. Your mother would be, he stopped. Restarted. Your mother once told me that the most dangerous thing about certainty was how comfortable it felt. He looked at Fawkes instead of Harry for a moment, then back. I have been very certain, for a very long time, about a great many things. I know, Harry said. I've read the audit documents. I've read my parents' letters. I know what you were certain about. And I think you should come to the Wisengamot hearing. Dumbledore blinked. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't that. Why? Because you're going to be called to account there anyway, when the proxy vote situation is addressed. It's better to come than to be summoned. And because, Harry paused, finding the right words. Because I think there's a version of this where you're part of fixing it, rather than just the person it's fixed against. But that requires you to stop managing the situation and start being honest about what happened. The quiet stretched. That is, Dumbledore said, very quietly, a very generous offer from someone I have treated poorly. It's a practical offer, Harry said. The generous part is that I mean it. Fawkes sang one note into the silence. Just the one, brief and clear, and the sound of it did something to the room, loosened something, or resolved something, the way a dissonant chord resolves when the right note is finally found. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long time. The warmth was still there, but it was different now. Not managed. Something more effortful and more real, the warmth of someone who had just had their understanding of a situation fundamentally revised and was recalibrating with visible effort. "I'll consider it," he said. It wasn't yes. But it wasn't what Harry had expected, which was deflection dressed as agreement. It was an actual consideration, from a man who was actually considering. "Thank you for seeing me," Harry said, and stood. "Harry." Dumbledore stopped him at the door. Harry turned. "The investigation, Madam Bones. What you've given her." "Everything that's documented," Harry said. "Including the Quirrell matter." Harry looked at him. This was new. "You know about Quirrell?" "I have known about Quirrell," Dumbledore said, carefully, "for some time. I have been managing the situation." "Managing," Harry said, and the word had weight behind it now, both of them aware of the weight. "What is it you're managing toward?" "There is something in this castle that Voldemort wants," Dumbledore said. "Something I placed here deliberately, with certain protections, hoping he would come for it and that the attempt would what? Reveal him. Give us a chance to address him before he fully returns." Harry stood in the doorway and looked at the most powerful wizard in Britain and thought about his mother's research and the bronze disc in his pocket and Sirius in Azkaban and the shape of what it meant to use someone as bait without asking whether they'd like to be bait. "What's in the castle?" Harry asked. Dumbledore told him about the Philosopher's Stone. Harry listened to the whole thing, Flamel, the stone, the protections, the theory. He listened carefully and thoroughly, and when Dumbledore was done he said, "And if Voldemort gets through the protections? What happens to the students in this building? The protections are designed to, what happens to the students?" Harry said. "Specifically. If it goes wrong. What's the contingency?" Dumbledore was quiet. "There isn't one," Harry said. Not angry. Just accurate. You put something he wants in a building full of children and your contingency is that the protections will work. He paused. "I'd like to help design a better contingency." Another long silence. "You are," Dumbledore said, with the specific tone of someone who is making an admission that costs them something real, "not at all what I prepared for." "No," Harry said. "I know." He almost left it at that. Then, "But I'm what my parents raised. Even from a distance. So I think this is actually exactly what you should have expected." He walked out. Going down the spiral staircase, the gargoyle sliding back into place behind him, Harry felt the castle's resonance again, that deep, fundamental hum, louder now than it had ever been, as though the building itself had been listening and had something to say about the last hour. He put his hand on the stone wall beside the portrait of a long-dead witch who was currently pretending to sleep. "I know," he said quietly, to the castle in general. "We need a better plan." The wall was warm under his hand. Responsive. Like something agreeing. He went back to the common room, sat down at a table with his notes, and began writing. Not a letter this time. A strategy. Chapter 5. Trials and Inheritances. The Wizengamot convened in the lowest level of the Ministry of Magic, beneath the atrium, beneath the administrative floors, down in the part of the building that was old enough to have been built for permanence rather than function. The courtroom was circular and tiered, rows of seats rising in semicircles above a central floor that was lit by something that wasn't quite natural light and wasn't quite not, a cold pale illumination that fell on everything equally and had no shadows and made everyone look slightly more accountable than they were comfortable with. Harry arrived with Ragnarok at 8:30 on a Thursday morning in late October, walking through the ministry entrance with Ragnarok's permanent access token and the collective weight of 4 lordship titles that Bonewright had, with evident professional pleasure, encoded into a single document that Harry carried in his inner robe pocket. The atrium was already busy with ministry workers flowing around a golden fountain that he took note of and moved past. Several people recognized him. He didn't stop. Ragnarok walked beside him with the particular quality of goblin movement that suggested it wasn't walking so much as advancing. Bonewright was behind them with a case the size of a small trunk, and Sharpedge was beside Bonewright, because Sharpedge went where the important documentation went and the important documentation didn't travel without someone who could defend it. Harry had arranged the team himself and had found, in the arranging, that the goblins responded to direct instruction with a professional respect they didn't appear to extend to requests. He'd told them what he needed. They'd told him what was possible. They'd built from the overlap. Augusta Longbottom was waiting at the courtroom entrance. She wore deep green robes that had clearly been selected to make a specific point about the Longbottom family's standing, and the hat was extraordinary, dark, wide-brimmed, with a taxidermied vulture on it that managed to look both appropriate and threatening. Beside her stood Neville, in formal robes that fit him properly, which was a recent development that had involved his grandmother standing in a Madame Malkin's with the energy of someone who had been waiting for this particular occasion and intended the clothing to communicate it. Neville looked at Harry and gave one short nod that meant several things. "I'm ready, this is enormous, I trust you, let's go." Harry returned it. "Lord Potter," Augusta said. "Lady Longbottom," Harry said, because that was her correct title and it was correct to use it. "Are we ready?" "We have been ready," Augusta said, with the serenity of someone who had been ready for approximately 15 years, for some time. The courtroom was not full when they entered but it was filling. The Wizengamot in full session was 150 witches and wizards in plum-colored robes, arranged in their tiered seats with the mixed energy of a body that had been told something significant was coming and had arrived with opinions already formed. Harry recognized faces from documents and descriptions, the political landscape of wizarding Britain laid out in 3 dimensions, and he'd spent the past 2 weeks learning it the way he'd learned the Quidditch pitch, by paying attention to where things were and how they moved. He walked to the central floor and stood there and waited, and the courtroom settled around him with the quality of something finding its balance. Amelia Bones arrived at 8:45 from a side door and she was exactly what her reputation had always promised. She was a square-built woman in her 50s with a monocle that seemed less like an affectation and more like a precision instrument, and she carried herself with the absolute lack of performative authority that was the hallmark of people who had never needed to perform it. She'd been head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for 6 years and before that the most effective orator of her generation and before that the kind of student that teachers either loved or found deeply unsettling, depending on whether they were doing their jobs correctly. She looked at Harry with the monocle and gave him a nod that was brisk and genuine simultaneously. "Lord Potter. Everything's in order on our end." "Thank you, Madam Bones." Harry had been corresponding with her for 2 months and the correspondence had been one of the more educational experiences of his autumn. She didn't say more than was necessary. She didn't say less than was accurate. She also, he had noticed, had a habit of asking questions that she already knew the answers to as a method of checking whether other people knew them, and she'd stopped doing that with Harry after the second letter. "The Sirius Black Review comes after the inheritance hearing," she said. "I want the Dumbledore matter on the record first. It contextualizes." "Agreed." She moved to her position. Harry stood in the middle of the floor and looked up at the tiers, at the faces arranging themselves into legibility, those who were clearly uncomfortable, those who were clearly curious, those who had clearly already made decisions, and several who had the careful neutrality of people who were waiting to see what the evidence actually said before committing. Lucius Malfoy was in the 4th row in full Wizengamot robes, his silver cane across his knees, his expression a masterwork of composed contempt. He looked at Harry the way certain kinds of people looked at things that were inconveniencing them by existing. Harry looked back with the patient attention of someone making inventory and then looked away first, because he'd already catalogued what he needed. The Chief Warlock called the session to order. Dumbledore was not in his Chief Warlock seat. He was in the gallery, seated, not presiding. He'd recused himself from the chairship for this hearing, which was both legally appropriate and, Harry thought, a choice he'd made deliberately rather than having it forced. He sat in the gallery in robes of deep gray rather than his usual colors, watching the proceedings with the focused attention of someone who had decided to be present and was holding to that decision. Their eyes met once, briefly, before the session began. Harry gave him a nod. Dumbledore returned it. The first hour was procedural. Bonewright presented the Gringotts documentation in layers, first the lordship claims themselves, walking the Wizengamot through the legal basis for Harry's right to the Potter, Black, Peverell, and Slytherin inheritances with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 30 years anticipating every possible counterargument and had answers for all of them, arranged in order of likely deployment. The Potter and Black claims had already been accepted at the institutional level, those were confirmed months ago. The Peverell claim was what this hearing was formally about. The competing claimants were three. A Flint family branch with a thin and clearly speculative connection to a Peverell-adjacent family from the 1600s, which Bonewright dismissed in 11 minutes without apparent effort. A Selwyn family claim through a female line connection that was better constructed but relied on a piece of documentation that Sharp Edge had identified 6 weeks ago as a sophisticated forgery, which she presented with a kind of professional relish that Harry appreciated. And a third claim from an international party, a French family called Delacour who had a genuine though distant connection and who had, notably, filed their claim properly and without apparent bad faith, which Harry had decided in advance to handle differently from the others. When Bonewright finished dismissing the Flint and Selwyn claims, Harry stood before the Wizengamot could move to the Delacour matter. "If I may address the Delacour claim directly," he said. The chief warlock nodded. Around the tiers there was a shifting of attention. This wasn't standard procedure. "The Delacour family has a genuine if distant connection to the Peverell line," Harry said. "Their claim was filed in good faith and their documentation is accurate. I'd like to propose that rather than dismissal, the Wizengamot consider a formal acknowledgement of their connection, not a competing claim, but a recognition of shared lineage. The Peverell magic is old enough that the concept of singular inheritance seems less appropriate than a model of primary claim with acknowledged branches." There was a murmuring in the tiers. Bonewright was completely still in the way of someone who had not expected this and was revising rapidly. "In practical terms," Harry continued, "this means the lordship vests with me as the primary claimant and the Delacour acknowledgement grants their family access to certain aspects of the Peverell Heritage Archive that have no bearing on the lordship itself. It costs me nothing and it respects the fact that they filed honestly." He paused. "If the wizarding world is going to have a conversation about inheritance law, I prefer it to be a conversation that distinguishes between honest claims and dishonest ones." The murmuring got louder. Lucius Malfoy, Harry noticed, had gone very still. This was not what had been expected. It was hard to position against generosity. The chief warlock called for a vote on the modified proposal. It passed 47 to 12, with the 12 being mostly those whose own inheritance claims had narrow, self-interested reasons to prefer aggressive singular inheritance models. Bonewright leaned toward Harry and said, very quietly, "That was not in the plan." "It should have been," Harry said equally quietly. "We'll add it to the plan." Bonewright made a sound that was the goblin equivalent of conceding a point. The Peverell claim was formally confirmed. Harry felt the fourth inheritance settle, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but present, the specific quality of something that had been waiting at the edge of his awareness and had just been allowed in. The Slytherin claim would follow at a separate hearing in January, and that hearing would be considerably more political, but today's confirmation created the legal precedent that made it almost uncontestable. Then Amelia Bones stood. "With the Wizengamot's permission," she said, in the voice of someone who was technically asking permission and actually issuing an agenda, "I'd like to present findings from the DMLE investigation opened under Disclosure Reference 4471-B. This concerns matters arising directly from the Gringotts audit of the Potter-Black estates." Permission was granted, mostly because refusing it would have required a reason, and the only people with sufficient reasons to object were the ones who couldn't afford to be seen objecting. Amelia presented the DMLE findings with a thoroughness that Harry had been anticipating and a starkness he found genuinely impressive. She didn't editorialize. She laid out facts in sequence and let the sequence speak. The guardian authority claimed without petition, the will ignored, the serious black imprisonment arranged in the immediate aftermath of an event during which no standard investigative procedure had been followed, the account management discrepancies, the Wisengamot proxy votes cast illegally over a decade, the Hogwarts management framework built on those illegal votes. She presented it the way someone presents a building that has been built on a bad foundation, not to destroy the building, just to show why it can't stand where it is. The courtroom was very quiet by the time she finished. Then Lucius Malfoy stood. He had the kind of ease in these rooms that only comes from spending years in them, convinced of your own centrality. He looked around the tiers with a small smile that was designed to suggest he was doing everyone a favor by engaging with this at all. "The findings Madame Bones has presented," he said, in the smooth register of someone who had prepared thoroughly, "constitute a remarkably selective reading of decisions made in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Albus Dumbledore is a great man who acted under crisis conditions. To retroactively criminalize those decisions, nobody has used the word criminal," Amelia said, "is precisely the kind of revisionism that the Wisengamot should resist." "The greater good, I'd like to speak," Harry said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The courtroom had been waiting for him. Malfoy looked at him with the expression of someone who was in the middle of a speech and resents the interruption, which was also the expression of someone who cannot afford to show that resentment in front of this particular audience. "Lord Potter," the chief warlock said. "You may speak." Harry stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the assembled faces. Not at Malfoy. Not at Bones. Not at Dumbledore, though he was aware of him in the gallery with a peripheral acuity he'd been developing for months. At the middle-tier faces, the ones who had waited, who were listening, who hadn't decided yet. "I'm 11 years old," he said, and he said it without apology or softness, just as a fact that the room needed to hold. "I spent 10 years sleeping in a cupboard under a staircase. Not because my parents didn't provide for me, they did. Not because my family left me with nothing, they didn't. Because a series of decisions were made for me, without my knowledge, without my consent, and without any mechanism by which I could know or object." The quiet had its own weight now. "I'm not asking the Wisengamot to criminalize good intentions," Harry continued. "Lord Malfoy is correct that circumstances were difficult. I acknowledge that. My parents are dead. There was a war. Decisions were made quickly under pressure." He looked now at Malfoy directly, and held it. "But I am asking this body to be honest about what those decisions were. They were decisions made by one person, in the dark, about a child he'd been trusted to protect. They were decisions that served his priorities rather than mine. And they have been sustained by illegal procedural manipulation for over a decade." He let that land. "That is not the greater good," Harry said. "That is the use of a child as a resource. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just accurate, in the way that accurate things are sometimes the most powerful thing available." The tears were silent. Then, from halfway up on the left side, which Harry recognized from Bonebright's briefings, Griselda Marchbanks, who had been on the Wisengamot for 50 years and who had examined Dumbledore for his newts and reportedly told him he'd been brilliant and she still had reservations, said, "What does Lord Potter want from this body?" Harry looked at her. 3 things. First, formal acknowledgement that the guardianship arrangement was improperly established and that all decisions made under it require review. Second, the immediate opening of a formal review process for the Sirius Black imprisonment, given that the primary legal basis for that imprisonment, the claim that he acted against my family's interests, is directly contradicted by my parents' own documented intentions. Third, restructuring of the estate management framework so that no single individual can exercise this kind of authority over a minor's inheritance without oversight. "And Lord Dumbledore?" Marchbanks asked. "I don't believe the remedies require his destruction," Harry said. "I believe they require honesty and correction. What happens after that is between him, this body, and whatever standard of accountability you choose to apply to people who are powerful enough to make consequential mistakes and honest enough to own them." He paused. "I don't know yet which category he falls into. I'm waiting to find out." In the gallery, Dumbledore was very still. The Wizengamot deliberated for 40 minutes. Harry sat with Ragnock and Augusta and Neville in the anteroom and ate a sandwich that Augusta had brought in a small bag with the practicality of someone who knew that important proceedings always ran over time and that hungry people made worse decisions. "You were good," Neville said. "It was accurate," Harry said. "It was both," Augusta said, in her decisive way. She looked at Harry over her sandwich with an expression that was the warmest he'd seen on her face. "Your mother would have argued it more aggressively. Your father would have argued it with more flair. You split the difference." "My mother's notes," Harry said. "And my father's letter. They've been preparing me for this for 6 weeks." He looked at his hands, which were steady. "It doesn't feel like it's mine yet. The arguing. The political part. It will," Augusta said. "The first time you do something that frightens you and it works, it becomes yours." She ate her sandwich. "This will work." It worked. When they returned to the courtroom, the chief warlock read out the findings in the flat, precise language of official decisions that would be recorded in the Wizengamot archive, guardianship arrangement found to be improperly established, all subsequent decisions flagged for formal review. Wizengamot proxy votes cast under illegal guardian authority retroactively recorded as contested, with outcomes to be reviewed. An emergency review commission established for the Sirius Black case, to convene within 14 days. Lucius Malfoy voted against all 3 measures. He was joined by 11 others. The remaining votes were in favor. Bonewright was recording the outcome with a speed that suggested deep personal satisfaction. Harry sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him and let the decision settle. The restructuring of the management framework was tabled to a secondary session, which he'd expected. It was the most complex element and the most politically contested, because too many people on the Wizengamot had similar frameworks over similar estates and were not eager to examine them. But that was a later battle, and it would come, and he'd come prepared. He was halfway to the door when Dumbledore appeared beside him. Not blocking. Not imposing. Just, there, the way tall people can simply be present in a way that is itself a kind of communication. "Harry," he said. Harry stopped. They stood in the corridor outside the courtroom while the departing Wizengamot members flowed around them like water around 2 stones that had decided to be stationary. "I intend," Dumbledore said, "to make a formal statement to the review commission. About the decisions I made in 1981. He said it the way people say things that cost them something real, without the wrapping and without the warmth, just the words. Voluntarily. Without qualification. Harry looked at him. "Why?" "Because you were right," Dumbledore said simply. "And because the only thing I can offer at this point is honesty, which is arguably what I should have been offering all along." He paused. "I will not pretend the decisions didn't serve my purposes. They did. I believe they also served the greater good. I am less certain of that than I was." "Less certain," Harry said. "Less certain," Dumbledore confirmed, and there was something in his voice that wasn't the headmaster and wasn't the chief warlock and wasn't the greatest wizard of the age. It was something older and quieter and more honest than any of those, something that had been underneath them for a long time. "I have been certain for so long, Harry, that I had forgotten what uncertainty felt like. It is not comfortable." "No," Harry said. "But it's honest." "Yes." A pause. "The Philosopher's Stone situation, we're handling it," Harry said. "Madam Bones will be briefed this week. The detection report from Gringotts on the Quirrell matter is complete." He watched Dumbledore carefully. "If you want to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, then come to me with what you know rather than managing it alone. That's all I'm asking." The corridor was emptying around them. Someone's heels clicked on the stone floor 3 corridors over. Distantly, the enchanted ceiling of the atrium was doing something gold with mid-morning light. Dumbledore studied him for a long moment. "When I placed you with the Dursleys," he said, "I told myself it was the safest option. The blood protection. The Muggle environment reducing the risk of Voldemort's followers finding you. He paused. I knew it wasn't what your parents wanted. I knew Sirius was their choice. I made the decision I believed was necessary and I did not revisit it. I know, Harry said. I should have revisited it. Yes. No softening. Just agreement. But you can't undo it. You can only decide what you do from here. Dumbledore looked at Harry with an expression that was, finally, neither managing nor performing. Just a man looking at an 11-year-old who was conducting himself with more clarity and more fairness than the situation required. Your father, he said, would have been furious with me. Probably, Harry agreed. My mum would have been colder about it, which would have been worse. Something moved in Dumbledore's face. Almost a smile. The honest kind. Yes, he said. That is entirely accurate. Snape appeared at the far end of the corridor. He stood there for a moment, seeing them, and then came toward them with the particular quality of deliberate approach, someone who has decided to walk toward a thing rather than past it. He looked at Harry and then at Dumbledore and his expression was doing the thing where it covered everything, but Harry was getting better at reading what it covered. The hearing went as expected? Snape asked, directing it generally. Better, Harry said. The Sirius Black review is in 14 days. Something in Snape's jaw shifted. I see. You'll need to make a statement, Amelia Bones said from behind Snape, who did not visibly flinch but produced the aura of someone who very much wanted to. Bones came up the corridor with her monocle and her precise walk and stopped beside them. To the Review Commission. You were present in the initial days after the Potter attack. Your testimony about what was known and when is relevant. I'm aware of its relevance, Snape said. Good. Bones's voice was entirely professional and entirely inexorable. Will you give it voluntarily? Snape looked at Harry. Harry didn't say anything. He waited. Yes, Snape said, which cost him something visible. Voluntarily. Bones nodded. Good morning, gentlemen. She turned and walked away with the same quality she'd arrived with, complete, entirely self-possessed, already thinking about the next thing. Dumbledore watched her go. Amelia Bones, he said, with genuine respect, has always been exactly who she says she is. It's a useful quality, Harry said. Snape made a sound that was several things at once and departed in the opposite direction from Bones, which Harry suspected was more about composure management than direction preference. He watched him go and thought about the book with his mother's marginalia and Snape's, the two of them responding to each other across a gap of years, and thought, that statement is going to cost him more than the professional difficulty. It's going to cost him the story he's been telling himself about 1981. Some things could only be fixed by looking at them directly, and Snape had been looking at angles for so long that looking directly was going to be genuinely painful. Worth it. But painful. He left the ministry with Ragnarok, who walked beside him through the atrium in silence until they reached the telephone box exit, and then said, "That was well done." The Delacour proposal surprised Bonewright, Harry said. It surprised me as well, Ragnarok said, with the honesty of someone who found surprises professionally interesting rather than threatening. Where did it come from? My mum's journal, Harry said. She had a note on the Peverell inheritance. She wrote that the problem with the Wizarding World's approach to old magic was treating it like territory to be owned rather than knowledge to be shared. And that the way the inheritance laws were structured made everyone defensive and everyone adversarial and nobody actually got what they were really after. He thought about it. The Delacours didn't file a hostile claim. Treating them like they did seemed wrong. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Then, the Slytherin hearing in January will require this kind of thinking. The opposition will be more motivated. More organized. I know. Harry stopped at the telephone box. Ragnarok. The Sirius Black review is in 14 days. I'm aware. I need him out. We will do everything within our institutional authority, Ragnarok said, which from a goblin meant something considerably more comprehensive than the same words from a human. "Thank you," Harry said. Ragnarok looked at him. "Your mother thanked my assistant for finding an error," he said, in the tone of a non sequitur that was not a non sequitur at all. "She was the only client in my 30 years of directing who thanked a junior employee for doing their job correctly. Most people thank the institution or they thank me." He paused. "You thanked me this morning before the session began. Before anything had been achieved. Before you knew how it would go." Harry didn't say anything, waiting. "I am simply noting it," Ragnarok said, and something in his voice had the quality of something being filed in a permanent and important place. "Good morning, Lord Potter." "Good morning, Director." The telephone box. The mechanical voice. The atrium going away and London going on around him. He was back at Hogwarts by 3 o'clock, in time for afternoon charms, which Flitwick opened with a complex charm construction exercise that would have been challenging for a third year. Harry worked through it with half his attention while the other half was still in the Wisengamot courtroom, running the proceedings back, finding the points where it could have gone differently and cataloguing them for next time. There would be a next time. January, for the Slytherin hearing. The management framework restructuring. Whatever came with the Quirrell situation. He caught the charm on his 5th try, a full 6 minutes before anyone else in the room, and Flitwick made a small, delighted sound that he immediately converted into a professorial comment about technique. Ron, working beside him, got his on the 8th try and looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had made peace with being outpaced in charms specifically because his chess remained undefeated. Well, Harry said. "The serious thing?" 14 days. Ron nodded. He'd had a long conversation with his father over the October Hogsmeade weekend. Harry had arranged a communication channel through Ragnarok that didn't pass through Ministry Post, and Arthur Weasley had apparently spent the whole conversation with the expression of a man who had suspected something for years and was now being given the documentation to prove it. He'd cried once, briefly, and then started asking practical questions, which Ron said was how you knew it had hit him properly. "Dad says the ministry is going to be a mess," Ron said. "The proxy votes, the reviewed legislation. There are about 15 laws that passed in the last decade that are going to be," someone said the word contestable and Dad got his thinking face on and hasn't quite come back from it. 15 is probably conservative, Harry said. "That's what Dad said too." Ron worked his charm again, getting the angle more precise. "He also said, he wanted me to tell you, that what you're doing is right. Even if it's hard. Even if it makes things complicated for a while." "Things are already complicated," Harry said. "More complicated than." Ron shrugged. "Dad's philosophy is basically that complications are how you know you're dealing with something real." Harry smiled at his charm work. "I like your dad." "He'd like you," Ron said. "He likes people who break things for good reasons. He just usually disapproves of it. With you he'd probably just be interested." After dinner, Harry found Hermione in the library where she had established a semi-permanent territory between the advanced charms section and the historical records shelf, surrounded by what appeared to be 12 books open simultaneously. She looked up when he sat down with the expression of someone surfacing from deep water. "How did it go?" she said. "Well." He gave her the summary. Watched her face move through the stages of processing, taking in the facts, cross-referencing with what she knew, identifying implications, and then hitting the serious black element and doing something that was clearly an emotional response held in check by active effort. "He's been there for 12 years, she said. Without a trial. Just, because no one stopped to ask the right questions. Yes. That's," she pressed her lips together. "That's not supposed to be possible. The legal protections are only as good as the people willing to use them," Harry said. "Which is why the people who are willing to use them matter." Hermione looked at him with the direct look she'd been developing since September, the one that didn't defer and didn't perform, just looked and assessed and drew its own conclusions. "I want to help with the management framework restructuring." The legal case. I've been researching the estate law and there are 3 areas where the current code is genuinely ambiguous in ways that, I know, Harry said. I was counting on it. You were counting on me doing research you hadn't asked me to do. You were always going to do the research, he said. It would have been wasteful not to count on it. Hermione stared at him. Then she made a sound that was halfway between exasperation and laughter and pulled one of her 12 books toward her with new purpose. Fine. Sit down. I'll show you what I've found. He sat down and she showed him, and the library was warm and the night outside was dark and the fire in the grate was doing its steady amber work and somewhere in Azkaban a man was sitting with a bronze disc in his hand, waiting. 14 days, Harry had said. He meant to be exact about it. 11 days later, in the middle of a Thursday afternoon while Harry was in Transfiguration converting a tortoise-shell comb into something that McGonagall had described as theoretically beyond second-year work, a Patronus arrived. It came through the classroom wall as though the stone weren't there, silver, feline, distinctly bone-shaped in its precise and purposeful movement. It sat in the center of McGonagall's classroom and said, in Amelia Bones's clipped voice, "The Sirius Black emergency review is complete. The commission has voted. Mr. Black will be released from Azkaban this afternoon pending formal restoration of his status. You may wish to be available." The Patronus dissolved. McGonagall's classroom was very still. McGonagall looked at Harry with her precisely calibrated expression that communicated, without a single syllable, that she had known this was coming and had prepared the appropriate response. "Mr. Potter," she said. "I think we can consider the second half of this lesson self-directed study." Harry was already on his feet. The Hogsmeade Floo, by arrangement with Ragnarok, connected to a receiving room at St. Mungo's where the processing of Azkaban releases had been redirected at Bones's insistence. She'd apparently decided that conducting it at the ministry itself created too many opportunities for procedural interference by people who hadn't yet accepted the commission's findings. Harry arrived in the receiving room at 3:45 and found Ragnarok already there, and Augusta Longbottom, who had apparently been notified and had apparently traveled from her home in 30 minutes, which suggested either excellent Floo connections or a woman who had been packed for this day for a while. A healer stood near the door with the particular look of someone whose medical professionalism was working very hard against a personal reaction. At 4:20 the door opened. He was thinner than the photograph Harry had seen. The photographs in the family documents had been from before Azkaban, a young man with dark hair and the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up both loved and brilliant, laughing at something, James Potter's arm around his shoulders in the mirror image of the photograph Harry carried in his wallet. In those photographs Sirius Black had been 21 and the world had been something he moved through like a person who assumed it would continue to make sense. What came through the door was 12 years older than that and showed it. The bones of his face were sharper than they should have been. His hair was long and rough. His eyes were the same, gray, quick, alert, the eyes of someone whose mind had refused to go wherever Azkaban tried to send it, but around them was the evidence of what refusing had cost. He stopped when he saw Harry. He stopped completely, in the way that large things stop, not hesitation, not shock exactly, something more fundamental. He stood in the doorway and looked at Harry and his face did something that Harry had no adequate category for, something that was grief and relief and 12 years of distance colliding with a present that was real and immediate and standing 3 meters away from him. Harry crossed the distance. Sirius pulled him in like a man who had been practicing the move in his head for over a decade. He was not gentle about it. He was thorough and certain and he said something against Harry's hair that wasn't entirely words but that communicated itself directly past language and Harry held on with both arms and let him. After a while Sirius pulled back and held Harry at arm's length and looked at him with the specific look of someone conducting an assessment they've been waiting a long time to conduct. "James's face," he said. "And Mum's eyes," Harry said. "Everyone says. They're right. Sirius's voice was rough. 12 years of Dementors did that, Harry supposed. You're okay. He stopped. Are you actually okay? Because I know where they put you and I know, I'm all right, Harry said. I wasn't great for a while. But I'm all right now. Sirius looked at him hard. You got them back, he said. The accounts. The names. All 4. Well, 3 confirmed, 1 pending for January. Something moved through Sirius's face, sharp, satisfied, the expression of someone getting news they'd been desperate for and finding it was better than they'd hoped. Lily's line. She always said, she told James, she found something in the genealogy that connected, the Peverell line. Yes. Her research is in the room of requirement. I've read all of it. Sirius stared at him. Of course you have. He looked at the ceiling and breathed. Of course you have, you absolute miniature version of both of them. Ragnarok needs you to sign some things, Harry said. Sirius laughed, which was a sound that was rough around the edges and genuine at the core, the laugh of someone discovering their laughing machinery still worked. Yes. Fine. Documents. Classic Potter. He looked at Harry again. The disc. I got your signal in October. First week. I got yours, Sirius said, about 2 weeks in. I thought, he stopped. I thought I was imagining it. And then it kept coming and I thought the Dementors had finally got to me. He ran a hand through his hair. But then I thought, if this is a hallucination then it's the best one I've had, so I might as well respond. It got through because of the blood magic, Harry said. Bonewright's theory. Bonewright, Sirius repeated, apparently testing the name. Senior legal goblin. Terrifying in documents. You'll like him. Sirius looked at him with an expression that was still doing several things at once, the relief and the grief and now something warmer and more present, something that was starting to be itself rather than the absence of something else. You know, he said, James always said if anything happened, you'd turn out fine. He was absolute about it. Lily was more, she was more careful about being absolute about things, Harry said. Yes. But she'd cry when she said it, which meant the same thing. Sirius's voice was steady but his jaw was working. You got her research. The journals. All of it. Then you know what she thought. About the protection. Yes. She was right, Sirius said simply. She was right about almost everything. That was both extraordinary and occasionally deeply irritating. He looked at Harry one more time, and the looking had a quality of trying to make real something that had been theoretical for 12 years. I am going to be insufferably invested in your life going forward, just to give you fair warning. I'm counting on it, Harry said. Ragnarok, from across the room, cleared his throat in the manner of someone who respected reunions and also had paperwork that was not going to wait indefinitely. Sirius looked at him. You're Ragnarok. I am, Ragnarok said. Harry speaks well of you. Lord Potter, Ragnarok said, is a credit to his family. He held out the documents. If you're ready. Sirius took the quill. He signed the first document, and then the second, and then he got to the third, the one that formally restored his status as Harry's magical guardian and legal next of kin, and he signed it with the particular quality of someone signing something they thought they would never get to sign, and the parchment glowed the same gold and dark that Harry's had, the Black family magic formal and ancient and making official what had always been true. Augusta Longbottom, who had been standing to one side in her hat throughout all of this, said, Welcome back, Mr. Black. I should tell you that your house elf has been maintaining Grimmauld Place in your absence, which is either admirable loyalty or a deeply unsettling attachment to cleaning, and that the Black family accounts are in better order than you might expect, thanks to Director Ragnarok's people. Sirius looked at her. Augusta Longbottom. Last I saw you, you threw a howler at Bartemius Crouch in the ministry atrium. He deserved it, Augusta said serenely. He absolutely did, Sirius agreed. He looked at Harry. Right. Documents. And then, what? Where are you? You're at Hogwarts. Back tonight, Harry said. Quidditch match Saturday. Of course there is. Sirius looked at the ceiling. First thing we do when you're home for Christmas is I teach you the seeker maneuvers your father never learned because he was a chaser. He'd have argued that point, Harry said. He'd have been wrong, Sirius said, with the fondness of someone who had been arguing this for 20 years and was delighted to still have the argument. He was brilliant on a broom. Terrible seeker. I keep telling him in the portrait. He stopped. Swallowed. The portrait's in the vault. I talked to them, Harry said. Not enough yet. But I'm going to. Sirius looked at him. The grey eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears and everything to do with someone who had just discovered that the world was still real and still worth being in. Good, he said. Good. The healer had stepped discreetly aside. Augusta was reviewing something with Ragnarok near the window. The receiving room held its warm, ordinary light, and outside St. Mungo's the streets of London went about their business, entirely oblivious to the fact that something had just been put right that had been wrong for 12 years. Harry stood beside his godfather in the ordinary light and felt the weight of the day settle, the Wisingamat, the vote, the hearing, the commission, and now this, and thought about his mother's letter and the journal in the room of requirement and the page that said the closest analogy is a person who has become entirely themselves. Not yet, he thought. But closer. Every day, closer. Chapter 6, What the Vaults Remember. December came to Hogwarts with snow that arrived properly, the way Scottish snow knew how to arrive, not tentatively, not as a suggestion, but as a full commitment, overnight, so that the castle woke up on a Tuesday morning with 3 feet of it on every surface and the grounds turned into something that looked like it had been painted by someone who took winter personally. Harry stood at the dormitory window at 6 in the morning and watched the grounds go white in the early dark and felt the castle hum around him with something that had been building since October, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, a sense of readiness that he'd been learning to recognize the way you learn to recognize a key change in music you know well. Today was the day. Not chosen arbitrarily. Bonewright had identified the winter solstice week as the optimal window for the final inheritance working. The Slytherin claim's formal hearing wasn't until January, but there was a secondary element to the Peverell-Slytherin inheritance that operated on different principles than Wisingamat procedure. His mother's research had documented it thoroughly, 3 journals in, dense with theory and practical notes and 2 pages of calculations that Hermione had checked and rechecked over November and confirmed were correct. The Deathly Hallows. He had all 3. The cloak had been in the Potter Trust vault since before his birth, his father's, passed down through the Peverell line, the single most perfect invisibility cloak in existence. Harry had worn it twice. The first time he'd stood in the vault and put it on and felt the particular quality of absence it created, not invisibility so much as irrelevance to the world's attention, which was a different and more absolute thing. The second time he'd used it to cross the Hogwarts grounds at midnight to check the wards himself after the Gringotts detection report confirmed what he'd suspected about Quirrell. The stone had been harder to find. His mother's research had placed it not in the Philosopher's Stone situation. Flamel's stone was something different, a separate and coincidental use of the same word that had confused the trail for years. The Resurrection Stone was smaller and darker and had been lost in the Gaunt family line for generations, sliding from one terrible keeper to another, ending up, his mother's notes had followed the chain with the patience of someone who loved puzzles, in a ring that had passed to Marvolo Gaunt and then to his son Morphin and then, when the Ministry imprisoned Morphin on false evidence that Harry was becoming increasingly certain had been manufactured, into the possession of Tom Riddle, who had taken it as a Horcrux anchor. That was the word his mother had written in the margin of her final journal, Horcrux. Underlined twice, the way she underlined things that were important and disturbing simultaneously. He split his soul. I don't know how many times. I think this is why he can't die the way a person dies, there's not enough of him in one place. The ring is one. I suspect the diary he's been circulating in Death Eater circles is another. There may be more. The protection I'm building should account for this. A fragment of a soul still responds to sacrificial magic, perhaps better than a whole one, because fragments are unstable and instability makes them vulnerable to things that wholeness would resist. If I'm right, and I am right, the fragment attached to my son will eventually need to be addressed. But not yet. Not for years. When he's ready. Harry had spent a week with that page before he'd told anyone. Then he'd told Hermione, because Hermione needed to know and because she was, as he'd expected, capable of holding the information with the same steady focus she gave everything. Her face had done something complicated for about 30 seconds and then she'd said, "Right, what do we do about it?" in the tone of someone converting shock directly into problem solving, which was the most Hermione response possible and the one he'd needed. The ring with its Horcrux had been in Dumbledore's private collection. The one Ragnarok's Cursebreakers had traced. The one purchased with Harry's money. That conversation had happened a week before the Wisengamot hearing. Harry had gone to Dumbledore's office and laid the documentation on his desk, his mother's research, the Gringotts trace on the purchase, the theory, and Dumbledore had sat with it for a long time without speaking. Then he'd produced the ring from a locked cabinet and set it on the desk between them. It was a plain gold ring with a black stone, and the stone had a crack in it that had been there since before Harry was born. The Horcrux inside it was something Harry could feel at the edges, dark, compressed, wrong in the specific way of things that had been forced into shapes they weren't meant to occupy. "You know what it is," Dumbledore had said. "Yes. My mother documented it. She was extraordinary." Said with the simple weight of someone who had failed someone extraordinary and was now sitting with the full awareness of that failure. "The Horcrux needs to be removed from the stone before the stone can be used correctly," Harry said. "My mother's notes have a process. It requires specific conditions." He paused. "And it requires the cloak and the wand as well. All three components." Dumbledore had looked at him. "You have the cloak." "Yes." "The Elder Wand," Dumbledore said, and his voice carried the weight of someone about to make a decision that he'd been circling for a long time, "is currently in my possession. I acquired it, through means I'm not proud of, decades ago. I've carried it since." He paused. "It is not mine by right." "No," Harry agreed. "It isn't." The silence had stretched. Outside the office window, Hogwarts had been doing its evening thing with light and dark. "If I give it to you," Dumbledore said. "It stops being a target," Harry said. "For anyone who might want to take it from you, which is more people than you've accounted for. And the inheritance is complete. And the working my mother designed can be done." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "I'm not asking you to give it to me as a gesture. I'm telling you it's what the magic requires and what the situation requires and what is right." Another long silence. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "It is." He'd taken the Elder Wand from inside his robes and held it for a moment, this thin, dark piece of wood that had belonged to his family for generations, that had passed through conquest and loss across centuries, that had shaped and been shaped by every hand that held it. He looked at it with the expression of someone saying goodbye to something that had been important for so long that the importance had become invisible. Then he held it out. Harry took it. The Elder Wand was warm and it was immediate and it fit in a way that had nothing to do with compatibility and everything to do with recognition. It knew the Peverell magic and the Peverell magic knew it, and in his hand the thing felt not like a weapon and not like a tool but like the last piece of something complex and very old finally finding its correct position. He'd kept all three with him since. The cloak in his bag. The ring in an inner pocket, warded by three separate containment charms that Hermione and Sharp-Edge had designed together over 2 weeks of correspondence. The wand in his hand more often than his holly wand now, because it suited him and he wasn't going to pretend it didn't. He'd also spent November getting very good at what he could do with it. Quirrell was the most immediate problem and they'd dealt with it before December. Madame Bones, briefed by Ragnarok's possession detection documentation, had coordinated with McGonagall and 2 senior Aurors, and the intervention had happened on a Sunday evening when the corridor outside the 3rd floor was empty. Harry had been there, because he'd insisted, and because Bones had looked at him for a long moment and then said yes on the basis that it was his castle and his situation and she wasn't going to treat him like he didn't have standing. What lived in the back of Quirrell's head had come out screaming and ugly when it was confronted, and Harry had stood in the corridor with the Elder Wand in his hand and the containment circle that Sharp-Edge had designed drawn on the floor and felt the Horcrux fragment react to his mother's protection magic, react, recoil, and then dissolve, because his mother had been right about fragments being vulnerable to sacrificial magic and about her protection having a specific character that dark magic couldn't take anything from. Quirrell, when it was over, had sat down in the middle of the corridor and looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally been allowed to put it down. He'd cried. Harry had given him a handkerchief, because that was what you did. He'd been in St. Mungo's since, recovering. The prognosis, according to the healer's report that Bones had shared, was careful but positive. The Philosopher's Stone had been removed from its vault by Flamel himself, who'd been contacted directly, and who had arrived at Hogwarts to collect it with the expression of a man who was 600 years old and had survived a great deal by not keeping his most important possessions in other people's buildings. Harry had shaken his hand. Flamel had looked at him with very old eyes and said, in French accented English, "Your mother wrote to me. In 1980. About the Peverell research." He'd paused. "She was right about all of it." "I know," Harry said. "You have her exactness," Flamel said. "And his, what is the word, the refusal to be diminished." He'd squeezed Harry's hand once, firmly. "Good luck, young lord." That left the working itself. The process his mother had documented required 3 conditions, all 3 hallows in the hands of their rightful inheritor, the Horcrux removed from the stone, and the solstice, which was when the Peverell family magic operated at its strongest, something about the turning of the year and the specific character of light during the longest night, which Hermione had found a theoretical basis for in 2 different sources and which Harry had accepted not because he fully understood it but because the magic in his bones was doing something that felt like anticipation as the date got closer. The room of requirement, this morning, before breakfast. That was the plan. He dressed quietly while Ron and Neville slept. Put the cloak in his pocket. Checked the ring's containment. The Elder Wand was warm in his hand. He went to the door of the dormitory and then stopped, because he'd been intending to do this alone and was now, standing at the door in the pre-dawn quiet, questioning that intention. He went back. Shook Ron's shoulder. Ron opened one eye. "It's dark. The working is this morning." The eye focused. Ron sat up immediately, which was the measure of how seriously he'd been taking this. "Right. Yes. Neville." "Let him sleep," Harry started, and then Neville said, from his bed without moving, "I'm awake. I've been awake since 5. So there were 3 of them going down the corridor in the early dark, Hermione meeting them at the foot of the tower stairs as though she'd known, which she probably had, because Hermione applied predictive reasoning to people the way she applied it to everything else, and Harry's patterns were, apparently, legible. She looked at him with her direct look and said, "Ready?" "Yes," Harry said. "All of you should wait outside the room." "This part, we know," Hermione said. "We'll be outside." The 7th floor corridor was empty and cold, and the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy was doing its usual textile thing in the torchlight. Harry walked past the blank wall 3 times, thinking clearly and specifically, and the door appeared. Inside, the room had configured itself differently from the study it usually was. The fire was there, the desk, his mother's journals on their shelf. But the center of the room was clear, a circle of floor about 4 meters across, and in the center of the circle the floor itself had changed quality, the stone smoother and darker, with a faint marking that he hadn't put there and that looked, when he tilted his head, like a convergence of 4 symbols that he recognized from his reading as the Founder's marks. The castle, setting the stage. He walked to the center of the circle and stood. He had all 3. The cloak came out of his pocket and he held it in his left hand. The ring, carefully, out of its containment. The Horcrux was gone, had been gone since October, and what remained was just the stone, dark and cracked and patient, sitting in its gold setting like something that had been waiting longer than he'd been alive. He held it in his right hand, open palm. The Elder Wand was already in his hand, because it had felt wrong to put it down since he'd taken it. He stood in the center of the Founder's marks in the room his mother had built for him, and he held all three of the things his family had been building toward for 3 generations, and he waited. The working, his mother had written, wasn't a spell. It wasn't performed. It was recognized. The 3 components of the Peverell family magic were each an aspect of a single thing, and when a person carried all 3 aspects genuinely, through inheritance, through the earned right of being fully themselves in the way the family had meant, the recognition was what happened, not a casting but an arrival. Like a key, she'd written, and crossed it out, and written convergent, and crossed that out, and written, like a person who has become entirely themselves. Harry stood in the room and let himself be entirely himself. He let himself be his mother's son, her exactness, her love for the logic that ran beneath magic, her fearlessness in the face of things that were true even when they were hard. He let himself be his father's son, the instinct, the protectiveness, the refusal to be diminished that Flamel had named. He let himself be a Potter and a Black and a Peverell and, yes, even a Slytherin, because the Slytherin magic in him was real and it was his and it was not dark, it was formal and ancient and built on contract and consequence and the absolute belief that power was real and should be handled honestly rather than pretended away. He let himself be Harry, the boy from the cupboard who had learned not to hope for things and then, at 11, discovered that hoping was not the point, that claiming was the point, that the world could be addressed directly rather than waited on. The 3 objects in his hands went warm simultaneously. Not the warmth of enchantment. The warmth of recognition. The light that came after had no adequate description in any language Harry had yet learned, but it was gold and it was not a color so much as a quality, the quality of something being made whole, of aspects that had been separate finding the arrangement they'd always been built for. It moved through the room without disturbing anything, as though it were native to the space, as though the space had always been waiting to hold it. It lasted approximately 30 seconds. When it faded, Harry was still standing in the center of the circle. The cloak in his left hand, the ring in his right, the Elder Wand between them. Everything looked exactly the same. The fire was still burning. His mother's journals were on their shelf. He felt different. Not dramatically. Not overwhelmingly. The way you feel different when something that has been slightly wrong for your entire life has finally been corrected, that subtle, disorienting rightness, like the world coming into focus. He also felt, with a clarity that hadn't been there before, something small and dark and not his own, sitting in a chamber in the castle below him. Not the Quirrell fragment, that was gone. Something else. Something he'd known about since reading his mother's note and that he'd been choosing not to address until the working was done because he'd needed everything else in place first. He put the cloak and the ring carefully in his pockets. He held the Elder Wand. Then he sat down on the floor in the center of the circle and he turned his attention inward, not to the dark thing, not yet, but to the protection his mother had woven into him, which he could feel now with a completeness he hadn't had before, the full shape of it, the specific quality of her intention in it. She described it as the opposite of taking. He could feel that. It was warmth and it was her and it was 14 months of a woman who loved magic and loved her son and had made the most brilliant and most terrible choice anyone had ever made in that combination. He sat with it for a while. Then he stood, picked up his mother's final journal from the shelf, opened it to the last page, and read the last line she'd written, which he hadn't been able to read all the way through in October and had been waiting to finish. Whatever it costs, it will have been worth it. You are the best thing I ever made. He put the journal back. Went outside. Ron and Hermione and Neville were in the corridor, sitting on the floor with their backs against the wall, Ron eating something he'd apparently thought to bring, Hermione reading, Neville with his eyes closed in a way that wasn't sleep but was something deliberate and quiet. They looked up when he came out. Hermione's eyes went immediately to his face and did their rapid assessment. Done. Done. You're okay. Yes. And? Harry looked at them. These 3 people who had chosen him with no obligation to, who had built themselves into something with him over 3 months of classes and common rooms and letters and chess and the kind of late-night conversations that only happened when you were 11 and the world was enormous and you were all figuring it out together. He looked at them and felt the specific gratitude of someone who had spent a long time not having this and knew exactly what it was worth. "There's one more thing," he said. "In the castle. Below us. I need to take care of it." Ron got to his feet. "Lead on then." "It could be dangerous," Harry said. "Yes," Ron said patiently, "and—" Neville stood up. "I'll come." Hermione was already putting her book away. "Obviously." Harry looked at the three of them for a moment, and then he stopped overthinking it, which was his mother's instinct warring with his father's and his mother's winning. "Right," he said. "This way." He led them down. The thing in the castle was in a chamber that had been there since the Founder's time, directly below the dungeon level, accessible through a passage that had been sealed for decades and that the castle opened for Harry without ceremony, the stones shifting aside with the ease of something that had been waiting to show this particular person this particular thing. It was a small chamber, plain stone, empty except for the object on a low plinth in the center. A locket. Gold, green-stoned, old. Harry felt the Horcrux in it from the doorway, the same compressed wrongness he'd felt in the ring, the same sense of something forced into a shape it wasn't meant to occupy. But this one was different from the rings, less dormant, more aware. It knew he was there. He could feel its attention like a finger of cold. Hermione made a small sound behind him. "That's a piece of him." "Yes." Harry walked toward it without hurrying. The locket's awareness pressed harder as he approached. He felt it push at the edges of his thoughts, looking for purchase, for fear, for something it could use. Finding the Peverell convergence instead, finding his mother's protection, finding something it fundamentally couldn't navigate because it worked by taking and there was nothing in Harry available for taking. He picked it up. The cold flared, sharp and deliberate, a direct attempt. He held it steady and held himself steady and turned inward to the warmth that was his mother's making and his own and the 4 houses of his blood and the castle humming around him, and he let the warmth do what it was built to do. The locket didn't shatter. It didn't scream. It made a sound that was quieter and more final than either of those, a sound like something very old releasing the grip it had been keeping for a very long time. The cold in it went out like a candle. He set it back on the plinth. "Is it?" Neville started. "Yes," Harry said. "It's done." He looked at the empty locket for a moment. Then he looked up at the ceiling of the chamber, which was plain stone, and above it were the dungeons, and above that were the classrooms, and above that was the castle doing its enormous, patient, ancient work, and somewhere in the walls was the resonance he'd been feeling since September, and he thought, 2 Horcruxes. His mother had documented 2. There may be more, she'd written. He'd find them. Not today. Today was full enough. But he would find them, and he would do what needed doing, and he wouldn't wait for someone to tell him to, because that was the shape of who he was now, and he wasn't going to make it smaller because it was convenient. Ron was watching him with the expression that he got when he processed something large and had decided to be practical about it. "More?" he asked. "Probably," Harry said. "Right," Ron said. "After Christmas then." "After Christmas," Harry agreed. They walked back up to the castle together, 4 of them climbing through levels of stone and history and the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of magic doing what magic was meant for, and when they reached the ground floor the castle was waking up around them, distant sounds of breakfast preparations, early rising students, the particular quality of a school morning that was ordinary in all the ways that ordinary was extraordinary when you'd spent long enough without it. The great hall was half full when they reached it. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table in his usual spot, and Hermione put books down, and Ron served himself 3 things at once, and Neville had tea, and the morning was what it was, normal and chosen and entirely his. Owls arrived with the post. Harry's, a Gringotts standard bird with a seal he recognized, carrying a letter that he opened while spreading butter on toast. Lord Potter, The Slytherin hearing has been moved to December 19 at the request of 3 Wisengamot members who wish to be present and are unavailable in January. Director Ragnarok concurs this is advantageous. Please advise if this timeline is acceptable. He wrote back in the margin, acceptable. I'll be there, and sent it with the owl. 2 days later, a different letter, personal post rather than institutional, the handwriting on the outside familiar from 3 months of practicing how to read it from the disc's patterns. Harry, I've been in Grimmauld Place a week. Creature has cleaned everything 3 times and made his opinion of my return known through the medium of extremely pointed domestic efficiency. The portraits are delighted and have not stopped talking since I unlocked them, which I'm choosing to take as a positive sign even though your grandfather's opinion on my wardrobe choices circa 1979 is not something I required in such detail. Dumbledore came by. We talked for 2 hours. I won't say it went well, exactly, because it went honestly, which is a different standard. He told me things he should have told me years ago. I told him things I've been keeping since Azkaban. We both behaved like adults, which I would count as a significant personal achievement for both of us. I don't forgive him. I also don't think he expects to be forgiven. He expects to be held accountable, which I think is what you did to him, and I think it's better. He also told me about the Hallows. I'm choosing not to have a reaction to the full scope of what you've apparently accomplished at 11 years old until I've had at least one Christmas with you present and can process it in person. This is a self-preservation instinct. The disc is warm all the time now. I've been keeping it in my jacket pocket. It keeps me calibrated. Come home for Christmas, kid. This is your house too. Sirius Harry read the letter twice and then folded it along its creases. He thought about Grimmauld Place, which he'd never seen. About the Black family portraits and the extreme cleaning standards of one creature. About Sirius, up and walking around in a house that was trying to become a home after 12 years of being neither. He put the letter in his inner pocket with his parents' letters, where things went that were important enough to carry. The morning went on. Percy Weasley stopped by the table to discuss something about the Wisengamot procedure documentation with Harry and then stayed for 20 minutes having what appeared to be, for Percy, an unusually relaxed conversation, during which Ron kept giving the back of his brother's head a specific look that was somewhere between who is this and yes, this is better. Neville had his herbology notes out and was making additions in a new notebook that Professor Sprout had apparently given him personally with the notation that his insights on root system interactions with soil magic were publishable with slight revision, which Neville had received with the particular stunned quality of someone finding out their best instincts are professionally validated. Hermione was writing something that had 3 different colors of ink and a system of symbols in the margins that Harry had learned to read as her working through a problem she was excited about. She didn't look up, but when he slid the marmalade toward her without being asked she reached for it without looking and said, "Thank you," with the absent certainty of someone who knew their context. Across the hall at the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was sitting with Zabini in a more private configuration than usual, and their conversation had the quality of something that was not small talk. Harry had noticed Malfoy watching the Wisengamot proceedings in the Prophet. He'd had the paper folded to those pages 3 days running. He hadn't approached Harry again. But the watching had a different quality now. Less prepared. More actual. They'd see. Not everyone's arc resolved quickly, and Harry wasn't interested in forcing it. Professor McGonagall arrived at the staff table and looked across the hall in her brief, comprehensive way, taking inventory of the morning. Her eyes stopped on Harry for a moment. He nodded. She gave her small, controlled nod back, the one that meant she knew what had happened, or enough of it, and she approved, or enough of it, and she was not going to make it easier to discuss than that because ease was not her primary mode and they both understood this perfectly. It was, Harry thought, one of the most efficient relationships he'd developed. The day's post brought one more thing, at the end of breakfast, delivered by the smallest owl in the school carrying an envelope that was slightly too big for it in the way of something addressed without quite knowing the correct size. It had a French postmark. Inside, one page, in careful English with the formality of someone writing in their second language and wanting to be precise, "Dear Lord Potter, we received the documentation from the Wisengamot regarding the Peverell acknowledgement. Our family is grateful for the generosity of your proposal and the respect it showed for an honest claim. We accept the terms. A pause of blank line. My granddaughter Fleur has been accepted at Hogwarts through the Triwizard Exchange Program in 3 years. I hope she will have the opportunity to meet you. With respect and family regard, Apollon Delacour. Harry folded it and smiled at the table. Hermione glanced up and raised her eyebrows. He showed her the letter. She read it, and he watched the piece of her that was always tracking the political implications process it and then the piece that was simply pleased about a thing being right. Good, she said. Yes, Harry said. The December light through the great hall's windows was doing its winter thing, coming in at a low angle and falling on the tables in long bars that caught the steam from the food and made it golden. The enchanted ceiling above was grey-white with the kind of clouds that meant more snow by afternoon. The hall was warm and full of people eating breakfast and talking and doing the 1,000 ordinary things that filled the space between large events. Harry sat in the middle of it and ate his toast and was present. Not managing the present. Not monitoring it for incoming complications. Not maintaining awareness of all the threads, Slytherin hearing in 5 days, Horcruxes to find, management framework restructuring pending, Sirius resettling, Quirrell recovering, Dumbledore making his voluntary statement to the review commission next week. All of it was real and all of it would need his attention and he would give it. But right now was breakfast. The Morning Post. His friends in their seats. The castle doing what it did. He thought about the room of requirement and the light that had no adequate description. He thought about standing in the center of the Founder's Marks and letting himself be entirely himself, and what that had felt like, and how it wasn't finished, not a destination, a direction. He'd be doing it for the rest of his life, the same way you kept breathing, because that was what living was. He thought about the locket on its plinth and the cold going out. He thought about more. He thought about his parents' portraits in the vault, small and waiting, and about Christmas coming in Grimmauld Place and Sirius making something out of a house that had mostly been a monument to itself for a very long time. He thought about what you built when you weren't building against something. What you made when the making was the point rather than the defending. He thought about Hogwarts above and below and around him, the castle that had been waiting for this and was humming with something that was the magical equivalent of satisfaction, and about the Slytherin journal on its shelf in the room with "You're quite late" on its first page, and about the quality of being late and arriving anyway and what it meant to find a thing after it had been waiting. Late, he thought. And here. Both things true. Both things fine. Ron finished his second plate and looked at the ceiling with the expression he got when he was about to say something that was genuinely what he thought rather than a version of it. You know what I keep thinking about? What? Harry said. The fact that it was goblins. Ron shook his head, with the particular wonder of someone whose worldview is in active revision. The thing that started all of it. Not the Ministry, not the Wisengamot, not any of the people who were supposed to be watching out for you. Goblins. Because their audit triggered. The audit triggered because their ward caught Dumbledore trying to access the Black Vault, Harry said. 6 times. 7th time it alarmed. So Dumbledore tried to take something he didn't have the right to take from a vault that said no. Ron turned his cup. And the whole thing unraveled from there. Everything unravels from somewhere, Harry said. The question is whether someone pulls the thread. Ron looked at him. You pulled it. Ragnarok brought it to me, Harry said. I pulled it. Hermione organized it. Neville stood in the courtroom. Amelia Bones ran the investigation. Your dad made sure people in the Ministry were asking the right questions. He spread his hands. It was a lot of threads. Yeah, Ron said. But someone has to start. Harry thought about a Tuesday morning in July. A quiet that wasn't right. A knock on the door. A goblin with amber eyes and a leather case full of documents and the particular quality of someone who had 10,000 years of institutional authority behind them and had decided today was the day to use it on behalf of a boy in a cupboard. Someone always starts, Harry said. That's the whole thing. Someone always starts. The hall went on around them. The snow outside was beginning again, soft and specific, covering the grounds in its second commitment of the week. The castle held everything in its walls: history, magic, 1,000 years of children learning to be themselves and occasionally making it, and in its deepest part a resonance that had been waiting for this particular convergence and had it now and was quiet with the specific quality of something fulfilled. Not finished. Nothing was finished. But begun, properly and irrevocably, in the way that things begun in honesty continue regardless of what tries to stop them, because honesty has a momentum that manages its own sustaining. Harry picked up his pumpkin juice. Looked at the table of people around him. Looked at the castle above him, and thought about the vault below with the 2 small portraits and the letters written in 2 different kinds of handwriting and the bronze disc in his pocket warm against his ribs. He held it all. Then he put his glass down and looked at Ron. Chess after dinner. Ron's face arranged itself into the specific expression of someone presented with an invitation they have absolutely no intention of declining. I'm going to beat you this time. You haven't yet. That's what I say before I beat you. That's what you say every time. And one of these times, Ron said serenely, I'm going to be right. Harry grinned. Hermione turned a page. Neville underlined something in his notebook. The snow came down outside. The castle hummed.